Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the extended day ahead market stakeholder meeting where we'll be discussing the straw proposal for this initiative. My name is Isabella Nicosia with ISO Stakeholder Affairs. The meeting materials that we will be discussing today are available out on the California ISO website on the initiative webpage. So you'll find the agenda, straw proposal, as well as the presentation that we'll be going through today. We will have the opportunity for questions throughout the day today. We will give you instructions on how to either enter the queue virtually or raise your hand in person when it is time for questions. But before we get started, I just wanted to go through a few meeting reminders and housekeeping slides. So first off, refreshments are available to you throughout the day in the back of the room, as well out to the right of through these doors in the atrium area, and that will be refreshed throughout the day. So please feel free to grab coffee and tea and water when you need to. There's also a ISO guest lounge out there available for you to use as well. And then during lunch, we will be offering 2 tours. So there will be one at noon and one at 12:30. And so if you haven't already signed up and are interested, there is a tour sign-up sheet located in the lobby at the meeting check-in desk. So you can sign up there as well. So for our meeting reminders, today's call is recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. So any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And these calls and meetings are structured to stimulate an honest and engaging open dialogue and engage different perspectives. So we hope that you have reviewed the materials in advance so we can have a nice, robust discussion today. And then in the interest of time, we do have a pretty tight agenda, so please refrain from repeating or reiterating what has already been said, just so we can get through as many questions as we possibly can today. And lastly, if you need any technical assistance during the meeting for our virtual participants, please send a chat to the event producer. Her name is Shreyas. But lastly, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to an engaging discussion over the next day and a half.
Great. Thank you, Isabella. So good morning, everyone. And for those joining virtually, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. This is our first in-person meeting since the pandemic and our first time in this brave new world of hybrid meetings. So please bear with us as we work through some of the challenges. We are pleased to have more than 100 people here with us in person and more than 200 also joining virtually. So really appreciate the level of participation. Our goal today is to make today's meeting as engaging and interactive as possible with all of you here in person, as well as those of you joining virtually. And so we'll have plenty of opportunity throughout the day to ask questions. A quick look at the agenda over the next day and a half. Before we jump into sort of the nuts and bolts of the 4 major components of the Edam straw proposal, we're going to hear some opening remarks from Elliot Mainzer and Mark Rothleader. We will then go into an overview of the stakeholder schedule and milestones by Miloš Bosanic. It'll give you a sense of where we're headed through the rest of the year and beyond. And then the rest of the morning, the ISO team will cover the 4 major components of the Edam proposal: the participation model, pre-day ahead activities, day ahead market processes, and the day ahead process outputs, market outputs. After lunch, we will move into some focused discussions presented by the ISO subject matter experts. And for the topics of resource sufficiency and transmission commitment. For both of those topics, we will also feature 2 stakeholder panels moderated by and made up of stakeholders who will share their perspectives on those topics. Then for those of you here in person at the end of today, we hope you will join us for a networking reception at Scott's Seafood here in Old Town Folsom. So look forward to seeing you there. Tomorrow, day 2, it's a half a day. We'll begin with a panel of Governance Review Committee members for an important update on governance. We'll then follow with a focused discussion on GHG accounting presented by the ISO, And after a short break, we'll hear from another stakeholder on GHG accounting. So as I mentioned, we will have various opportunities throughout today, and especially for tomorrow, we're going to have a dedicated time for stakeholders to ask questions, provide comments, and feedback on all aspects of the straw proposal. So now that you know what's in store over the next day and a half, let's go ahead and kick things off with some opening remarks from the ISO's President and CEO, Elliot Mainzer.
Hi, everybody. Elliot Mainzer with the ISO. I wanted to just take a couple moments to be with you electronically today. I know how busy this and other weeks are. As a matter of fact, I had a long previously scheduled engagement for today up in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I wanted just to really thank you all so much for your investment of time and energy into the Edam process. All the feedback and input that many of you gave us in the front end to get us to the straw proposal was so incredibly helpful. And I know the next couple of days are going to be super valuable in terms of further clarifying the conceptual design. And as we now really move into the next phase of really putting much more detail and content into the detailed design, it's going to be super helpful to have your input. And the team is going to continue to do our very, very best to synthesize and move this process forward based off your input and design considerations. So thanks again for all the time and energy that you're investing in our process. Also, I think it's really important, and I'm really happy that you're going to get a chance to get a good solid update on what's happening on the governance side. It just can't overestimate how important that element of the conversation is as well. So a chance to hear from GRC members and what's happening on that side. And then, of course, I'm quite encouraged that Chairman Holden of the Assembly Appropriations Committee in California has advanced his continuing resolution. That starts really raising the profile of the issue within California, because we just know that the governance reforms and governance changes are going to be essential over time to the success of Edam and beyond. So thank you guys so much for the time. I really wish I could be there. There's so many of you I haven't seen in so long in person. It would have been super fun to some high fives and handshakes, but I know you guys will have a really productive session, and just super excited about the next phase of this initiative. And thanks again for being part of it. All right, all the best.
All right, as Elliot mentioned, he really did want to be here, especially for our first stakeholder meeting in over 2 years. He hasn't met everybody, in person, so he's really looking forward to a future opportunity to meet all of you in person at the next opportunity. So Mark Rothleader is here. He is the ISO's Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer. And so I would like to invite Mark to come up to the stage for some opening remarks, as well as some meeting objectives.
Thanks, Joanne. And I got my prepared statements here, so if I'm reading, so be it. I feel a little nervous. Feels like a wedding and a family reunion all at once, and I don't know how those always go. So welcome back to the ISO. This is the first full stakeholder meeting in over 2 years. A lot has occurred during that time. Despite the pandemic, we recognize the world has not stopped. With the events of August 2020, we have new experiences and awarenesses of important matters around resource adequacy and how transformation across the West in the face of climate change-induced events is creating more challenges on the system. WEIM has delivered more than expected on operational and economic benefits, reaching $2 billion in less than 2 years after reaching the $1 billion mark. We welcomed new WEIM entities, BPA, Tucson, Avista, and Tacoma, on board this year. And then only a few weeks ago, we reached a milestone for the California ISO in which we had more renewable energy being produced on a Sunday than what our demand was. It's just demonstrating the fact that we can operate at 100% renewable. Obviously, we have other resources that we're backing that up for later in the evening, but now the question is, can we do it for more hours? Late last year, we restarted efforts to considered and developed the Edam design. Fortunately, we were not starting from scratch. We were able to build on the excellent work of the EIM entities. We restarted with developing some common principles, then gained some input support from utility industry leaders and regulatory bodies to ensure that our course was set. Then in the first 3 months of this year, we convened working groups at an expeditious, some would say crazy pace. Nonetheless, we listened and processed the information we heard to develop the straw proposal on schedule on April 28th. Today, we are here to discuss the straw proposal, diving into some areas with some examples. But we're also here to listen and receive initial feedback from you all on the straw proposal. We know the straw proposal is not the final proposal. We value the feedback we are going to receive today and in writing on June 6th. And I just set expectations. I'm expecting you will come out of here maybe a little bit disappointed that there's not more detail, maybe wanting more. I think that's okay. This is a longer process. We will be going through several iterations, and we can't go through all the details today. So I just wanted to make sure that our expectations are set. Based on the attendance today, as well as individual discussions, and knowing there are competing alternatives being discussed in other forums, we sense there is genuine interest to keep this development moving forward. We are committed to seeing this process through. In that regard, we continue to target the end of the year of having a final or near final proposal with all the necessary details ready for us to brief the EIM governing body and the Board of Governors. We also understand there is significant interest and interplay with parallel design initiatives related to the day-ahead market enhancements, wheel-through, transmission management, resource efficiency as it relates to WEIM, and finally, price formation issues, all of which are either in progress or will be starting shortly. Also in parallel are important discussions, as Elliot Mainzer said, about how Edam initial and going forward design decisions will be considered and governed, building on the constructed evolution of the WEIM governance. Before I introduce the California ISO speakers, I want to just say thank you to Joanne and her team, as well as Angela, my assistant, for helping organize today, as well as the social event this evening. I also want to thank you all for prioritizing your scarce time to attend this event. With that, today's speakers representing our policy, settlement, legal, customer team, today these representatives and others from their teams are responsible for producing the straw proposal and should be commended for the product they produced. It was an excellent product. It read quite well. You may not agree with everything that's in there, but I've gotten all the comments I've received is it really read well. And I just want to say thank you. So today we've got Milos Pasanik, our regional market sector manager, George Angelidis, our executive principal for power systems, John Anders, assistant general counsel, Parther Malvikar, our principal resource adequacy, infrastructure, and grid enhancements, James Lynn, I think will be joining us remotely, senior advisor, market settlement design, Danny Johnson, lead policy developer, James Frederick, lead policy developer, and Anya Gilbert, our lead policy developer. So with that, I will let the day begin.
All right. Thank you, Mark, and good morning, everybody. All right, we're on the right slide. So just to move on to the next slide here, we'll start a little bit with a discussion on process, where we are in the overall stakeholder process, and what are the Edam milestones as we chart out the rest of the year here. And in terms of the stakeholder process, as you can see, we're fairly early in the stakeholder policy development process. We're at the straw proposal stage, but I do want to acknowledge and reiterate what Mark noted, that we started this stakeholder process with a series of stakeholder working groups, which is a bit of a new process for us that I think positioned us well to take in stakeholder input and perspectives, and really helped inform that straw proposal. And I hope that that comes through in that straw proposal that's been published. So we really appreciate all your engagement. And as you can see here in this roadmap, there will be additional iterations of stakeholder of straw proposals as we target the final proposal publication, and then going ultimately to the board and the EIM governing body for decision. And then I'll touch on in the next slide on some of the milestones that go even beyond that time frame into 2023 and to 2024. Okay. All right, so just to give us a little bit of an insight into Edam milestones in this particular quarter. This quarter is really focused on the straw proposal and activities associated with the straw proposal. As you can see there, we published the straw proposal at the end of April. We have the stakeholder meetings today, and then stakeholder comments are due on June 16. We're also planning Edam technical workshops in the later part of June and July 6th. And you'll see once we publish the comments template later this week, we're seeking stakeholder feedback as well on what are the appropriate topics here that warrant further in-depth discussions, more technical discussions over that period. I think we know of a few. You'll hear about those a bit later today: transmission, resource sufficiency, different components. But we certainly want to hear from you what are some of those additional topics that warrant a deeper dive and that will help inform the next iteration of the straw proposal. As we look at Q3, then we're targeting at that point publication of the revised straw proposal in the mid-August timeframe, August 11th, and then a stakeholder meeting in the later part of August, with stakeholder comments being due in the early part of September 9th. And then we're also targeting publication of what we call a draft tariff framework. For those of you that may be familiar what we did back in the day with the EIM, we started with the tariff development process. We started with a presentation of a tariff framework, and we think that's a good starting point in the EDAM as well. Having that understanding of the tariff framework will, I think, foster that understanding of the proposal, and will be reflected in the tariff. And effectively, that framework is an outline of the rules that will apply to EDAM entities. And then following publication of that tariff framework, the next step would be to reflect the proposal in a more detailed draft of the tariff that will take us into Q4. In Q4, we're looking at publication of the draft final proposal in the mid-October timeframe with a stakeholder meeting in the early part of November. We would also, around that timeframe, publish the draft tariff language based on that draft final proposal to start that process and vetting with stakeholders. Stakeholder comments then would be due in the middle part of November, with us targeting publication then of the final proposal on December 7th, ahead of that briefing to the board in mid-December. As Mark said, we recognize this is a fairly tight timeline, and we'll continue monitoring as we receive stakeholder feedback and as we go through the rest of the stakeholder process. Looking at 2023 then, we will continue that tariff development process with stakeholders post that briefing with the board. It will take a little bit of time in iterating with stakeholders, as is customary in our process. Stakeholder comments, we publish updated drafts of the tariff, but we would ultimately target a FERC filing in Q2 of 2023. And then implementation activities would be slated for the fall of 2023 release in accordance with our release timelines. And this will all then position us to, in 2024, be ready to onboard and go live with the EDAM for any willing entities at that point. So hopefully that gives you a bit of insights into the EDAM milestones that are coming up. I want to now just move as quickly to just now start into the discussion of the more substantive portion of the program. And as we go through the process, we will pause then towards the end. Once we walk through the slides, we'll pause for about half an hour to 40 minutes of stakeholder questions. There will also be an opportunity as well on day 2, if you look at the agenda, we've left about an hour or so for stakeholder comments and questions as well. So let's see here. Okay, so we'll start with an overview of the Edam participation model, and then we'll delve into some of the more substantive components of the Edam framework design. So, building on the collaboration of the EIM, an extended day-ahead market really allows for the opportunity to build on those economic, operational, reliability, and environmental benefits by co-optimizing and committing resources to serve load in the day-ahead time frame across that wider footprint. Participation in the Edam is at a balancing authority area level. The participating entity is the EIM balancing authority area. And effectively, a prerequisite to participation in the Edam is also participation in the EIM. In other words, to participate in the day-ahead market, an entity also needs to participate in the real-time market. And as we go through the presentation today, we'll capture how these different design elements of the Edam help derive those benefits that we've talked about. We talked about economic benefits, reliability benefits, environmental benefits, and operational benefits. So we'll touch on all of those throughout our presentation today. But I think it's also important to highlight that an entity that's participating in the Edam continues to retain key responsibilities and key functions. The balancing authority area retains its reliability function. Effectively, they're responsible to manage and maintain the reliability in their own balancing authority area, consistent with the applicable standards, obligations, just as they do today. They also retain their transmission planning function. As today, they continue to plan and expand their transmission system consistent with their own processes and the tariff. The Edam does not change that. The Edam does not take on that role. And then finally, they also retain each participating Edam balancing authority area retains their resource planning function. Each Edam area, each Edam BA, each Edam entity is responsible for its long-term resource planning consistent with their own requirements and any regulatory requirements that they may be beholden to. So this structure is, again, consistent with the EIM today, where participating entities continue to retain those same functions and the ability to determine and manage their own resource planning, transmission planning, and manage their own reliability. A little bit more now on the voluntary nature of the participation model, and we propose effectively an extension of the EIM voluntary participation model focused on ease of entry and ease of exit from the Edam. As noted earlier, a balancing authority area that's participating in EIM, the EIM entity can voluntarily elect to join and participate in the Edam. And voluntary participation does not necessarily mean a decision on whether or not to participate in Edam on a day-by-day basis, but it's a voluntary commitment to participate in the Edam and be bound by the terms of that participation. An entity can continue to solely participate in the EIM. There's no obligation to join the Edam. You can have EIM entities that do not participate in the Edam, so there's no obligation to participate in the Edam. We also propose the voluntary exit framework that's also part of the EIM today, in that an entity can choose to exit the Edam with a 6-month notice with no exit fees. We don't propose at this time any minimum participation commitment period, but rather retain that 6-month exit notice provision that entities are familiar today with in the EIM. In the straw proposal, we've also noted retention of key safeguards that I think are present in the EIM today that provide for measures that can be taken to the extent there are unexpected reliability or other market impacts as a result of Edam participation. We have a number of these measures that are in place in the EIM today. We recognize that the Edam is a new step for the West, and we recognize the need to provide protections for individual Edam entities, including the ISO, to the extent of their adverse impacts or unexpected reliability or market impacts of that participation. Just as an example, and we'll list a number of these in the straw proposal, but an example of these safeguards is providing the ability to temporarily suspend participation of an Edam entity following implementation, during that implementation period, to the extent that there are any market or system operational challenges. Another example is the ability to interrupt Edam participation when operational circumstances have caused or likely to cause abnormal conditions or require immediate actions to maintain reliability. These are common safeguards that are in place today in the EIM, and we would look to effectively extend those to provide that confidence. Let me touch on now. Let's talk a little bit just to wrap up this discussion on Edam participation model. Let me touch on briefly on the resource participation in the Edam and how that compares to the EIM today. I know that some of you may have questions on that comparison. And in the EIM, resources can be participating or non-participating resources. Those that are participating, they can offer into the market and be dispatched through the EIM and are settled through the EIM. But the EIMBA can submit base schedules as well, representing those resources not into the market, and these are not necessarily settled through the market. However, in the EDAM, all transactions will be settled through the market, as you'll hear a bit later today in the settlement section of the discussion. This means that all resources and load in the BA will be effectively participating in the market, and those resources are operational. They will either be self-scheduling in the market or they'll be economically offered into the market. And in that day-ahead time frame, we're not necessarily extending or proposing to extend a base scheduling model. We don't think that a base scheduling concept that's currently the EIM, it's not really conducive to an efficient market, as effectively base scheduling means that an amount of load and of generation that's not in the market is not settled through the market, which I think creates certain inefficiencies, particularly in the day-ahead time frame. These unsettled flows, as it's noted there on the slide, these unsettled flows that are associated with base scheduling in the day-ahead market context could potentially create congestion and create certain uplifts that may be borne by other market participants. And so we don't believe that a base scheduling model is appropriate for the EDAM at this stage. To the extent that certain entities believe that there is a motivation for a base scheduling approach to reflect a fixed price contract, for example, if there are small load serving entities that want to continue to pay a fixed contract price for generation and limit their exposure to market prices, there are mechanisms to do that within the day-ahead market to achieve those similar types of results, such as through self-scheduling in a contract, as well as a contract for differences with the supplier of that generation. But as I noted, in the EDAM today, as we've laid out the framework, we're not proposing a base scheduling model. Rather, all resources are in the market and they're either self-scheduled or economically offered. So with that, let me just now shift our attention a bit and give you a preview of where we're going for the rest of this morning discussion as we delve into some of the more substantive components of the EDAM design. The morning presentation will effectively follow this outline that you see here. We're going to first start with pre-day-ahead activities. These are activities that EDAM entities take to position themselves to participate in the day-ahead market. We're going to then cover day-ahead processes that occur between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. These are the different market components and how different types of resources as well can participate in the market through bids. And then we're going to conclude the morning session with a discussion on some of the outputs from the market. Once the market closes, there are certain settlements and implications, but we'll also close out with the important topic of confidence in market transfers and how the different elements of the design really contribute to that confidence that those transfers coming out of the market are reliable and entities can depend upon to serve their load. And we'll have an example on that topic.
Yes. I know it's going to be a long morning, and I know we were kind of wanting to get through the material and then take discussion or questions. I'm wondering if we just take maybe a couple, 2 or 3 questions in the subsection before we move on.
Yeah, that would be great. Let's do that.
Okay, we can do that. We can take some questions. So for the audience, if you just raise your hand, your real hand, and we'll call on you. You have to use the microphone. There's a little speaker icon. Press it, make sure your light turns red. And then Christina, for the virtual attendees, you have to raise your virtual hand. And Christina will be monitoring if we get questions virtually. All right, so I have one person here in the room here. Russ, if you could state your name and affiliation as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, Russ Manafel, BPA. Question on maybe a couple questions. So on the participation model, note the distinction where in the EIM there are participating resources, non-participating resources, and in the EIM, non-participating resources do have their a participating resource executes a contract executes an agreement with the CAISO, settles directly with the CAISO, whereas a non-participating resource does not have an arrangement with the CAISO. It does have its imbalance settled, but it's with the EIM entity, not with the ISO. So when the proposal states that all resources will be participating resources, it discusses how you can use self-schedules to avoid optimization, but it's still unclear to me if the remainder of the responsibilities and arrangements for all resources will be more like a participating resource where every generator would have to have an agreement with the CAISO and would be settled directly with the ISO, or will there be a subset of generators that settle with the CAISO and the remainder settle with the EIM, the EDAM entity?
Who wants to take that question? John Anders?
Yeah, thanks, Russ. This is John Anders. The details of some of that haven't been worked out yet, and certainly the tariff framework and development process will reflect those kinds of relationships. I think it's our expectation at a minimum that all of the resources would be represented by a scheduling coordinator, and it's likely that relationship could be determined by the resource owner, operator, controller, or the BA, or what. But today, even the non-participating resources are base scheduled by the EIM entity scheduling coordinator. So we would expect something similar. The details of that remain to be determined, though. Thank you.
Does that answer your question, Russ? Okay, thanks. All right, Christina, do we have anybody virtually that has a question?
No, I don't see anybody in the queue. And by the way, you're also welcome to send your question or comment in the chat to me directly. But I'm not seeing.
Okay. Yes, Russ, go ahead again.
Yeah, but hoping to take a nap later, so let's get all my questions in now. So when in the presentation you discussed base scheduling creating inefficiencies, could you describe what base scheduling means in that context? Does that assume base scheduling is mutually exclusive with bidding into the market, and how is base scheduling separate from a self-schedule? So it's unclear to me what the distinctions are between bidding, self-scheduling, and base scheduling, and at what point base scheduling specifically starts to incur inefficiencies. And I think it probably is going to be based on assumptions about what that means. I was curious what those were.
I think that's you, George. Hit the icon, the actual picture. Okay, our PhD has technical difficulties with the microphone.
I haven't been trained on these new devices here. Good morning, everyone. This is George Angelidis with the ISO. Ross, the concept of the base schedule is actually escaping us as well for the day-ahead market, and I will explain. In the real-time market, the purpose of the base schedule is to reflect prior commitments from a previous market or from a previous process before you start the real-time market. And that's why the base schedules in the Western energy imbalance market, they're not receiving a settlement, because the assumption is that there have been already commercial arrangements for that energy before the market, so it's not the scope and purview of the EIM. For the day-ahead market, situation is different. The entire schedule of resources is subject to day-ahead settlement, including a self-schedule. So therefore, we don't see the concept of a base schedule being valid or applicable in the day-ahead market. For the inefficiencies that you're asking the question, is going on the hypothetical that if we had the concept of a base schedule apply in the day-ahead market to represent some prior commitments before you run the day-ahead market, and you would go to exclude a base schedule in the day-ahead market from receiving day-ahead settlement, then you will have inefficiencies because even if the energy cost of a balanced transaction between supply and demand cancels out, if it is in the same BAA, there are still differences because of the marginal cost of losses and congestion, and if these are not settled with the participant that has this transaction, obviously there's going to be cost shifting to other participants that participate in the market. So that's why even from the ISO point of view, the concept of the base schedule for the day-ahead market, we don't understand its value or its usefulness, and we are concerned that if we go with that feature, we'll have these financial problems.
Okay, so maybe to restate to make sure I understand. So, one, the inefficiencies are kind of based on assumption that a base schedule would want to be excluded from the market, which I understand in many different ways can create economic and operational inefficiencies. So, and beyond that, so it's not apparent to the ISO what the sort of previous, like how there would be an analog in the day ahead for the base schedules in the EIM, but maybe just testing if by product of our great imagination outside of the ISO we could create an analog. Would you be open, like, and we're able to articulate that? And if they weren't excluded, like, I assume the ISO would be open to hear, like, if we thought that there were benefits to a paradigm like that, if we're able to address those questions.
Yes. So we're open to any proposals that may bring, a concept that we need to consider in the day-ahead market. In fact, even in the early on in the workshops, we did toy with the idea of having a base schedule as a mechanism for using it for reference in the resource efficiency evaluation. Could also be used as a reference for the greenhouse gas accounting. So we have, run across this idea, but we don't have a solid understanding right now what would be a base schedule and how it will be used in the day-ahead market, but we're open to ideas. Thank you.
All right, thanks, George. Russ? Okay, you met your quota. I'm just kidding. Okay, all right, so Milosh?
Two questions.
Yes. Milosh, I'll turn it back to you to continue.
All right, thank you, Joanne. Okay, so now we move into the pre-day ahead activities discussion of the substantive design. So I'll just start briefly here to note that, today Edam entities, balancing authority areas and load serving entities position themselves going into the day ahead market, or into the pre-schedule effectively from their perspective. They position their resource fleet and they secure the necessary supply to meet their anticipated demand, and any level of uncertainty. They also today secure transmission to ensure that they have that robust portfolio to be able to deliver those resources to meet those needs. And that doesn't effectively change in the day ahead market in the Edam context. What you'll hear us talk about is that Edam entities have to come in and into the day ahead market sufficient, and there's a resource sufficiency evaluation that is going to be run. And entities, again, I think they do this today. They position their supply portfolios to meet those needs, and here they would be showing it to the market, as well as they would be bringing in transmission to the Edam that ultimately helps support those robust transfers between balancing authority areas to derive those robust benefits. So the next couple of sections of this pre-day ahead market activities discussion will focus on this concept of the resource sufficiency evaluation, what are its components, what does it look like, as well as how transmission is made available to the Edam, the different concepts of the buckets that we've been talking about, and the compensation associated with that transmission. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Danny to walk us through the resource sufficiency evaluation portion.
Oh, thank you, Milos. Let me advance the slide. Okay, one more. Okay, so if I had to describe the purpose of the Edam RSC, it generally would be to test to ensure that each BAA has sufficient supply and flexibility to meet the expected obligations that they would see in the upcoming 24 hours. To the extent that we are able to successfully do this, we think this then gives the participating EDAM BAAs confidence that all the resulting transfers that come out of the EDAM are mutually beneficial economic displacement, and that the capacity of one BAA is not being used to meet the needs of another BAA within the EDAM construct. If we take a step back to when we began or reinitialized the EDAM last fall, one of the principles put forward was that the EDAM should consider all supply that balancing authority areas may utilize for their next day plans to not create any barriers to entry. We do plan to continue this paradigm, as you'll see in some of the following slides, and how we plan to treat some of the different resource types that BAAs may utilize for setting up their systems for the next day. The other thing I want to note on this slide is that through the EDAM RSC, we are also looking to test to ensure that each participating BAA has the ability to meet uncertainty that can arise between the day-ahead timeframe and the real-time timeframe. This primarily will be accomplished through our Imbalance Reserve product, to the extent that we have a standardized metric of uncertainty that all balancing authority areas are equally able to meet. We think this then further increases the confidence in any transfers that may result from the EDAM. Next slide. So how is the ISO looking to do this? We are proposing to create a new novel application that will optimally use the resource bids made available by our participants to determine if a feasible operating schedule exists for the following day. So this is a single test for both capacity and flexibility for the BAA. It will be subject to all resource constraints that currently exist in the CAISO model. This does include intertemporal constraints, so your daily energy limitations, your daily startup limitations, all of the energy storage constraint or constraints related to energy storage resources will be part of this model in determining if there is a feasible schedule. I think as Milos noted earlier, we are looking to do this on a BAA by BAA basis. So this test would be run for each BAA. The BAA would pass and fail as a BAA. We would run this test at a few preset times, but also are looking to make it available to be run on demand. What this does and how this benefits potential BAAs is they would be able to submit the bids that they want to make available to the EDAM, run the test, see what the results are. Oh, is that better? Okay, yeah, that's better. Thanks, Partha. Yeah, so they're able to run the test and iteratively make different sets of resources available to the EDAM, ultimately resulting in them being able to pass the EDAM RSC. What gets tested for is the next obvious question. So the two things that we would look to test for would be the demand forecast for each hour over the upcoming day, as well as the imbalance reserves. There was some discussion in the working groups about who would submit the demand forecast. We're proposing to let any EDAM BAA submit their own demand forecast. Obviously, the CAISO would look to also provide forecasting services for any BAAs who are interested. For imbalance reserves, this is a quantity that would be calculated by the ISO. However, it would be calculated using the same methodology for all the participating BAAs, so everybody's treated equally. Regarding AS, at least with Go Live, this is not something that would be part of the EDAM because this starts to blur the reliability function of each BAA with the market function. So we would look to allow each BAA to self-provision the AS that they plan to utilize the next day. The EDAM RSC would simply check and ensure that the capacity that is withheld and planned for use for AS is not being double sold or is not being offered in the market also for economic use. For the CAISO, the status quo remains. The CAISO would continue to co-optimize its AS and energy in the day ahead. So if this is an optimal application that is using bids to determine a least cost solution, what spills out, the other thing that I need to add is that it is trying to maximize the number of intervals that a BAA would pass. So it will try to limit the shortfalls to the minimum number of hours across the 24-hour operating period. So as an output, a BAA would see the number of hours they may be resource insufficient, as well as the quantity of megawatts that they also may be insufficient by. This again feeds back into that iterative process where BAAs are able to cure insufficiencies. The other advantage of having this test that does a cost minimizing optimization on a BAA by BAA specific basis is it has the potential to serve as a baseline for the resource specific GHG approach to the extent that is the direction that the Edam design goes. So how does this integrate with the day ahead market? We would still plan to close the day ahead market at 10 a.m. and would look to run it between 10 a.m. and 1 a.m. The final binding test would be immediately. Oh, yeah. Yes, thank you. The final binding test would be immediately prior to that 10 a.m. closing of the day ahead market. We would, again, have two preset tests that we'd plan to run, one at 6 a.m., the second at 9 a.m. This is predicated on an application that we would be running to generate the imbalance reserve requirements. It's a little bit more computationally intensive, so we would want to limit how often we have to run it. So we'd run it at 6 a.m. The imbalance reserve requirement would then be available to be pulled as part of the on-demand application, as well as any demand forecast for a BAA to use between 6 and 9 a.m. At 9 a.m., we would run that application again to develop a final imbalance reserve requirement for each BAA. We would also look to freeze the forecast at 9 a.m. This then provides a BAA an entire hour with a fixed forecast that they can adjust their resource portfolios to eventually meet and pass the Edam RSC. I think it's worth noting again that this is a cost minimizing application. It will consider energy limits. The goal here is to determine if there is a feasible operating plan that can meet the requirements that are given by both the CAISO's calculation of imbalance reserves as well as the demand forecast with the resource fleet that's made available to the Edam. So before we get too much farther, I wanted to do a little contrasting with the WEIM RSC, since I think we naturally may get questions on this. How are these the same? How are they different? I think that they test for the same thing, which is resource sufficiency, but they do so in fundamentally different ways. I would attribute that difference to the EIM RSC being an incremental test. It utilizes base schedules or market schedules, looks at what the obligations are, and then calculates incremental requirements that it then validates the capacity and flexibility of resources made available by each BAA to meet. There's no similar reference in the Edam timeframe, at least that we're contemplating right now. It's a single test that determines if a feasible schedule is possible across that 24-hour period. It's testing supply offers against forecasted obligations, so your demand and imbalance reserve requirements, whereas the WEIM RSC is again testing base or market schedules incrementally, or it's developing incremental requirements based off those base or market schedules that an entity has to meet. The WEIM RSC also has two additional tests which are not part of the Edam. The first is the feasibility test. This is a check that tries to give BAAs foresight about where potential congestion may materialize. Again, when you look at the Edam RSC, this is running prior to running the market, so we don't actually have the energy schedules to even test and try to see where the congestion may be. The second test is the balancing test. This is to try to incent base schedules to be accurate towards forecasted obligation. Obviously, we don't have the base scheduling paradigm in this proposal for Edam, so this test would no longer be needed. For all potential Edam participants, the participation model would be similar to how the CAISO participates in the WEIM right now. The market schedules are what feed into the WEIM. So moving back to our commitment to try to be inclusive of all resources, I think the principle when it was posted last fall was to not impose any requirements on any integrated resource plans or RA programs that any potential EDAM BAAs may utilize. So in the spirit of not doing that, we've identified, at least on this slide, 3 kind of non-resource specific types of supply that we would like to count. The first would be firm energy contracts. These are commonly referred to as WSPP Schedule Cs. Our understanding is that these have historically been fairly reliable and are used by a number of balancing authority areas in the Western Interconnection to supplement their next day operating plans. We would plan to allow these to be included in the RSC supply stack. The supply would offset the obligation, the demand obligation that a BA is being tested against. For intertie bids at the ISO interties, we would propose to count these in the EDAM RSC, as well as to utilize these bids in the EDAM market clearing process. This would be consistent with how the CAISO currently clears its day-ahead market. Finally, with demand response programs, we do offer 2 existing models right now that allow demand response to directly participate in our market as resources. The first of these models is the proxy demand response model. The second is the reliability demand response model. Both of these models have some metering and telemetry requirements that demand response programs external to CAISO may not meet. We would still like to enable those programs to the extent that a BAA would plan to utilize and activate those the following day to meet their next day obligations to count in the EDAM RSC. There are some caveats on how this would be used that we'll walk through in a little more detail this afternoon. That really gets to ensuring that they can't be used to pass the EDAM's RSC and then the need to use them be offset by clearing additional EDAM transfers into the BAA who was planning to use them. But that's a detailed discussion I'll withhold for this afternoon. Moving on to more conventional resources, obviously gas resources are going to count. We have heard some concerns regarding the market timelines for the EDAM not lining up with the fuel nomination timelines. This is a concern that we recognize and we're interested in learning more about. This is an ongoing process, like Mark said earlier, so to the extent that BAAs may have concerns about this and may have fuel availability and storage limitations, we would like to understand what those are to see if our existing tools through bidding would give them the opportunity to participate or if we need to come up with new solutions. Moving on to hydro resources, obviously the CAISO currently has hydro.
EDAM meeting.
Yeah, this is the EDAM meeting.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it was one of those where they were requiring us to sit in the very back.
Well, yeah, I want to hear the rest
without
of
a desk. So it's like, forget it. Can't get work done at the same time.
All right, so for hydro resources, CAISO obviously has hydro resources. Right now, these can participate through daily energy limitations as well as energy bids. We do understand that there are some fairly complex hydro systems in the Pacific Northwest that may be more complicated to operate. One additional functionality that we have that we'd like to make everybody aware of is that we can actually aggregate hydro resources, an entire hydro project with multiple resources under a single resource ID. To the extent this is done, then the market will just give it a megawatt operating target, and the operator of that hydro project would then be able to optimize their own resources within that hydro project to meet the megawatt operating target. This isn't quite as much of a panacea as it sounds like. When you do this, the market is no longer able to perform congestion management on all of the transmission lines that may interconnect that hydro project. So to the extent that a BAA would be interested in this, this typically involves significant coordination between the CAISO and the generator operator. The last type of resource I want to talk about are variable energy resources. One of the phenomenons that we've observed is that the scheduling coordinators for variable energy resources typically aren't bidding into the day-ahead market to the maximum forecasted output. This is likely due to their not having an appetite for the risk at that maximum output. This is where the convergence bidding product in the CAISO comes in. Typically, we would see convergence bids that bridge that gap between what the forecasted output is and what is bid in. This may be because the convergence bidding parties have more appetite for risk. They may have different models and a different forecast that they're working off of. But what this does is when you combine the bids that are made available by the resource operator as well as the convergence bids, we have enough supply to clear the market, which is our goal. So to the extent that an entity would have convergence bids, I think we would actually look to utilize the forecasted output of the renewable resource in the RSC rather than the bid-in output. So this is a little bit different. The other side of this is we would also look to have the submission of RUC availability bids up to the forecasted amount. The residual unit commitment process is a reliability market run that we run after we clear the IFM that ensures that we have the right resource mix committed online to be able to reliably operate in the following day. For this to be successful, you have to have a pretty good idea of what the demand forecast and the expected output of renewable resources is in the following day. Getting renewable resources to offer RUC availability bids is a better market-based way to do this rather than trying to manually adjust the RUC targets. So we've talked about kind of what the purpose of the Edam is, or the Edam RSC is. We've talked about what feeds into the test, both on the requirement side and the resource side. The next thing I want to talk about is what are the consequences of failing the Edam RSC. So one of the things that we recognize through the working group process is that participating balancing authority areas have access to surplus supply today through the day-ahead bilateral markets in a day-ahead time frame. This is fundamentally different than when you think about the WEIM RSC, where really there's very, very little intra-hour bilateral supply that a BAA can access outside of like an emergency energy assistance paradigm. So given this, we don't really see any reason why the surplus supply that entities may have in non-stress system conditions should be transacted at prices that would be substantially different than the prevailing bilateral prices. So again, we're simply looking to not have penalties for failure consequences during non-stress system conditions when we would expect the entire interconnection to have quite a bit of a significant amount of surplus supply, because to the extent a BAA wanted to just go out and transact that bilaterally, they would be able to. We're trying to position the Edam as an alternative to those types of transactions. This is in alignment with the concerns that we've heard about insufficient forward procurement. Those concerns have typically been during stress system conditions. To the extent that entities do have concerns about this during non-stress system conditions, we would be interested in hearing about that and understanding what your concerns are. Now, when you move into stress system conditions, it's a completely different paradigm. We would not want the Edam to be used as a vehicle to avoid sufficient forward procurement decisions by any potential partner BAA. We would look to have an optional hurdle rate in the Edam at the bid cap that would allow additional supply to be cleared into the deficient balancing authority area. But again, it would be at the bid cap, so it'd be very expensive. And we think that would probably reflect the prevailing prices in the external day-ahead bilateral markets. The other concern that we heard is, what if one balancing authority area is really resource insufficient and there is a surplus of supply within the Edam footprint? Does that create a reliability risk, sending Edam transfers into the deficient balancing authority area? And our response would be no. We would plan to have a constraint in the market that would prevent any balancing authority area from exporting themselves into a shortage condition. Essentially, you wouldn't be allowed to have any Edam transfer exports if either the PBC or potentially the imbalance reserve procurement curves were relaxed as part of the market solution. So linking the Edam and the WEIM, I mentioned this earlier, but it's worth talking about again. The financial schedules produced by the Edam provide incentives for participants to make those same commitments in the real-time market via or regarding their resource availability. For Edam participants, their process would look pretty similar to the day-ahead and real-time market sequence process that the CAISO has. We run the day-ahead market. That then informs our real-time supply mix. Starts up the medium start units. The RTUC process then starts up the more short-term or short start units. The results of those processes are what feed into the WEIM RSC, and we would expect the results of those market processes for any potential Edam BAA to also feed into the WEIM RSC. We are also proposing a new concept for Edam parties as they are tested in the WEIM RSC, and this is a pooled approach. So the idea here is that the entire footprint that passes the Edam RSC would be tested as a pooled footprint in the WEIM RSC. This allows the Edam balancing authority areas to work together to pass the WEIM RSC. The other reason we think this is important is we are also looking to offer a diversity benefit similar to what is done in the Edam within the EIM within the constructs of the Edam. The idea here is that you can have offsetting uncertainty requirements over a broader geographic footprint. So to the extent that this happens, great. This ends up lowering the imbalance reserve procurement for each BAA. From a financial standpoint, this makes a lot of sense. Every entity has a lower day-ahead forward procurement requirement. However, if you test on an individual BAA basis in the WEIM, this does substantially increase the risk of failing the WEIM RSC because there is a lower amount of imbalance reserves procured, which is specifically there to address the uncertainty that can arise between when we're clearing the day-ahead market and when we're in real time. This is another item that we plan to have a much deeper discussion on this afternoon. So before I turn it over to Partha, I wanted to run through a quick four-hour sample of how we think this could work. So you can see there's 5 different resource types here. You have gas resources, VERS, imports, hydro. The hydro has a daily energy limitation. You also have storage resources. In this 4-hour sample, you can see the hours are the columns. You have energy and imbalance reserve obligations for each hour. So for the first hour, you have a lower obligation, 1,000 megawatts, 180 megawatts of IRU obligation. What the application will do is it will actually schedule 700 megawatts. It'll utilize the 700 megawatts of VERS. It would rely on 800 megawatts of import bids to charge the energy storage resources 500 megawatts. So you have 1,500 megawatts of supply to meet 1,000 megawatts of obligation plus 500 megawatts of energy storage. Great. Move on to the second hour. The second hour, the obligations are increasing, right? Load's going up. So you have 3,500 megawatt of obligation, 350 megawatts of imbalance reserve. Here you see the hydro supply being optimally used to meet the demand obligation in hour 2. So that's 1,000 megawatts of hydro. Hour 2 is good. The BAA can pass. You move to hour 3, the demand forecast has continued to ramp up. You're now at 5,000 megawatts. Here's where the application and its optimal use of the resources made available to it really shines. That 500 megawatts that it chose to charge in the first hour can now be shown as 500 megawatts of additional supply, which augments the 4,500 megawatts of otherwise conventional supply, allowing the BAA to pass. Now, for the imbalance reserve requirement in this third hour, we are just showing what it would look like if a BAA were to fail the Edam RSC. Here, they are 50 megawatts short of their imbalance reserve up obligation. This would result in a fail, and the penalty price would be set at what the relaxation would be for the imbalance reserve product, which is, at least right now through our DAME proposal, I think the lowest here is $247. Also here, I would point out that the hydro resource is being used another 1,000 megawatts. So that's the 2,000 megawatts of daily energy limit for that resource. Move to hour 4, load is ramping down and the remaining resources are used. So this ability to move around and optimally use the storage resources that we've have as part of our resource mix, as well as to optimally utilize the hydro, which may have daily energy limits, is the reason that we are looking to create this application. This stuff is really hard to represent on a base scheduling basis to the extent that you can have an application that optimally uses this based off a cost minimizing optimization that is, to us at least, a much better solution. So do we want to take questions here or hold off and pass it to Partha?
We'll take questions.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah,
We'll
thanks, Danny.
Does anybody have any questions?
So before we get to you, Jeff, we do have somebody virtually. So we are going to dive deeper into this topic a little bit later in the program, but we will take some clarifying questions. So I think we have Lindsay virtually. Go ahead, Lindsay.
Your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead. And also as a reminder, please accept the unmute message to get unmuted.
Go ahead, Lindsay.
Yes, please go ahead, Lindsay.
Hi, this is Lindsay Schluckaway from NV Energy. Can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
So I have a couple questions. The first one, you stated that the forecast would be frozen at 9 a.m. I was wondering, is that the same forecast that is going to be used for the Imbalance Reserve product, and what forecast will be used for RUC?
The forecast would be frozen at 9 a.m. and this would be the same forecast that would be used for RUC.
Oh, okay. And then for the WSPP Schedule C contracts, I was wondering if, well, in the paper, okay, so it stated that the energy would not be considered in the power balance constraint in IFM and RUC. And so I was wondering if the energy would be displaced in IFM.
I don't quite follow the question, Lindsay. Can you try again?
I guess so. As I understand it, is that this type of contract would be self-scheduled, and so I was wondering if at all this could be displaced or re-optimized in IFM to where it wouldn't actually occur. And so I was just kind of wondering, how do we represent that to the market so that?
Yes. So these would be self-scheduled. They can be relaxed, but it is way up on the penalty price tier in the scheduling run. So to the extent something really unusual isn't happening, we would expect these to not be relaxed, and they'd simply be settled as a price taker in the market run itself.
Okay. And is there also a special method that an entity would indicate that a resource is supplying this contract, or like how do you, I guess, would it also be a self-schedule for the resource side so that to indicate that this shouldn't be awarded energy in day ahead and that it stays committed?
Again, I didn't quite follow the question.
Okay, sorry. I'll rephrase. So how would an Edam entity basically indicate to CAISO that this generator is supplying this contract or something like that, so that it's not awarded energy in day ahead, or I don't know, it's at least receives the commitment, or the market recognizes this?
Okay, so I think I understand the question. I think to the extent we actually know the generator, that's a huge win, because then we're able to model it and can, through the transmission that Partha is going to talk about, show how it would participate in the Edam. The real challenge is actually when you don't know the generator. Then we would look to model these as a self-scheduled injection into the BAA, who they're syncing into at a preset scheduling point. But that we have a lot more questions on the WSPP. We're dedicating quite a bit of time to talk about that this afternoon.
Okay, that's helpful. That's a question. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Thanks. I think we have one question in the chat we're going to take next, and then we'll go to you, Jeff. Christina, you want to read the chat?
Yeah, so this question comes from Brian Cole, APS. How do we reconcile using WSPP Schedule C contracts which don't have physical resources backing them with a constrained resource market? For example, there could be 5,000 megawatts of WSPP contracts used to show resource efficiency by various BAAs with much less physical capacity available to actually be dispatched.
So we definitely recognize this challenge, and I think rather than directly answering it right now, I would hold off till this afternoon when we talk about the pros and cons of the different approaches we'd have to model these and try to put them into the IFM.
Okay, thanks. Jeff.
Good morning. Hopefully I figured out how to turn on the mic. Just a question on this slide, particularly column 3 or hour 3, where there's a failure. So as I understand it, the RSC process, this is showing just the RSC sort of pre-run process, right? This is not the market itself.
Yes.
And here they fail, and you're producing whatever a shadow price for the imbalance reserve of $247. I'm a little confused. Is your intent to charge the failing entity 247 times 50, or is your intent to not do anything about it? Or is this, if it's a scarcity hour, are you going to charge them the higher of the bid cap or the shadow price?
This is just illustrative. I think what they'd actually get charged would depend upon what the financial consequences look like, which at least at this phase of the proposal, or the failure consequences. So at this phase would be, is this happening in a stressed condition? Is it not happening in a stressed condition?
Okay, so just for clarity, just to understand the proposal, the current proposal is that this is a non-stress condition. Even if they fail, even if there's a high shadow, there's no financial consequence. Again, I'm trying to understand the proposal.
Yes, because we would expect that the BAA, to the extent they wanted to procure that extra 50 megawatts, would be able to do so from the bilateral market in the day-ahead time frame in a non-stressed condition.
And then in a stress condition, the proposal again is that if they failed, they would be charged 50 times the bid cap in this example?
50 times the relaxation price, of 247.
Okay, so I thought earlier you said that you'd penalize them at the hurdle rate that's a bid cap. So I'm trying to understand how this price works in with that price.
Yeah, can I clarify?
Just to understand the proposal.
Yeah, maybe I can help clarify. So this RSC 247 marginal price is just informational at this point. Is that correct, Danny?
Yes.
Okay, so it would be from the integrated forward market if we introduce that hurdle rate and that hurdle rate became binding, you'd see it there, not from the resource efficiency evaluation here. So this is just purely information.
I see.
Indicating the infeasibility of the resource efficiency itself for that hour.
So the proposal, I'm just trying to get the sequencing of the different markets going. So even if they fail this test, there's no immediate stress conditions. They fail. The proposal is there's no immediate penalty. You have to roll into the actual IFM, and to the extent they fail in the IFM, then there's a penalty.
Not so much failure. You've already failed.
And now you're buying.
You've already failed.
So if they're buying more than 400, the incremental amount in the IFM is penalized.
Let's hold. Let us get maybe I'll have this discussion a little bit later. We'll get back into this.
Just trying to understand the proposal.
More than just clarification, but I just want to make sure that we get the sequence right, and we'll articulate that later this afternoon.
All right, so let's go ahead and continue. Annie, thank you. You'll hand it over to Partha?
Yeah, I'll hand it over to Partha. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Danny. Before I cover the section on transmission supporting EDAM, I really wanted to give thanks to everyone who participated, particularly in the transmission working groups over the past month. We really had the opportunity to learn so much about the different transmission arrangements and structures within the West, along with different participants, opportunities and risks in sort of informing this design. So yeah, I really want to appreciate your engagement, and maybe I'll give a pre-thanks now for your continued engagement, because as you see from the proposal, we have a number of sort of outstanding questions that we're trying to get addressed. We're really looking for your all's feedback and involvement in terms of structuring that proposal going forward. So on this slide, we really sort of lay out kind of the core goals and structure of the transmission approach. So kind of at the fundamental level, for the ISO to run the EDM market, we really need transmission to be brought for optimization to allow both for a reliable and efficient EDM market dispatch. In turn, we learned a lot from participants about some of the constraints of making transmission available, such as from existing transmission contracts, and equity concerns and the needs to make sure that there is a fair cost recovery of transmission in the market. So in our proposal, we really try to strike an appropriate balance between these various priorities. However, as indicated earlier, we had several open issues which we're seeking further input, and I think we'll have a really opportunity to build on the concepts here in order to have a robust and well-functioning EDM market. And so, we'll say in advance, look forward to working with you all and brainstorming options as we move forward. While most of the discussion will be on the last bullet here going forward, I want to first note that in our proposal on the foundational method, for transmission internal to the BAAs, we're proposing that the internal system flow capability will be made available to support EDM transactions. This is really similar to the structure that we have in the WEIM market today. And that sort of the second, this is really what we'll be focusing on in terms of the bucket approach, is that the transmission at the interfaces between the EDM BAs will be made available to the EDM under these three bucket approaches, which we're going to discuss and which we did discuss as well as a part of the market working groups. So in this slide, we really highlight kind of the bucket one transmission, which was really that transmission that was sort of building up of how Danny explained for the RSE test. This was really the transmission required to support those resource sufficiency obligations. Kind of the first feature that we kind of outlined in the paper was, that we proposed that this really be high quality transmission, and really that was meant to be so sort of the objective that these was firm and conditional firm transmission was the right level of transmission necessary to give confidence and to support reliable transfers within that EDM structure. We also, and I think that we'll get into this in more detail later, but the trade-off was, as well as that bucket one transmission will be eligible to receive transmission revenue, and we'll really kind of go through the details of how those process works later on in the presentation. So next we really kind of outlined the bucket two transmission, and this was really seen as sort of incremental transmission made available by transmission customers to the EDM marketplace in exchange for congestion rents. Sort of similar to bucket one transmission, we proposed that this really needed to be high quality transmission, firm or conditionally firm, in order to give market participants confidence that the transfers that were scheduled coming out of the day-ahead market could in fact be relied upon. We sought some additional feedback as well in terms of whether or not the bucket two transmission scope should be expanded to include unscheduled transmission rights and some of the implications associated with that. And that really kind of the key elements that were really discussed there was, whether or not to include unscheduled transmission rights by 10 a.m. of the prior day to flow, and what were some of the consequences associated with either requiring that or not requiring that. And that's sort of one element that I think that we're seeking feedback and seeking to really understand sort of what the consequences are to market participants and whether or not this is really an opportunity that we should explore further in terms of developing out as a part of our future proposals. And then some of the consequences to that is clearly that there's a benefit to this proposal in terms of having a more robust and efficient market dispatch by allowing that unscheduled transmission to be made available to the market through this bucket 2 process. We also recognize that there might be, and we heard significant feedback in the working groups of some of the consequences of if those rights were unscheduled, but then were subsequently used by the party that hold those rights. But there may be uplift costs borne by the market in order to accommodate them if they're basically being flowed. So we basically sort of outlined in the proposal a little bit of the details around how that process would work, that we'd assign the uplift costs back to the EDAM entity, and there would be a sort of a subsequent process by the EDAM entity on how those redispatch costs would be assigned further to the appropriate parties. So moving on to bucket 3, and this is really, I think, going to be discussed. This is really going to be kind of the primary focus of our afternoon discussion, is really kind of focused on this bucket 3 concept, and that really, rather than having, which you'll see here, rather than having kind of one proposal that came out of this bucket 3, we really have 5 different approaches with different pros and cons. And that, some of them were focused a little more on, so at least if I were looking at kind of the working group and sort of what was focused on as part of the working group, we really kind of had, 2 approaches that were kind of focused on more, which approach 1 was really having the EDAM entities would make transmission available to the market for optimization at a hurdle rate. And so maybe taking a step back, really the bucket 3 transmission, what we're talking about here is really the transmission that's owned by the transmission provider, which has not been sold or paid for, and which the transmission provider and EDAM entity in that function will be making available to the market for dispatch. The second approach, which we discussed, and this we had a little bit of discussion of this towards the end of the market working group session, was maybe that we should continue with sort of the WEIM type approach of reciprocity, that there could be sort of an opportunity to make bucket 3 hurdle free through such a framework. And that the feedback that we received sort of in those working groups was that, I think the first thing on sort of these 2 approaches was that people saw the values and the reason behind them, that the approach 1, I think kind of at the foundational level, really allowed for fair cost recovery of that transmission that was not already sold to the market, and allowed that the market to use that transmission, but also allowed for those transmission providers with unsold transmission to get cost recovery. Approach 2, on the other hand, people really saw the benefits of in terms of allowing for efficient dispatch. But the question, particularly around approach 1, was, in effect, I think, can we do better? And is there really an opportunity to have some other alternative approaches that allow for a more efficient dispatch without having a hurdle in the optimization, but still allow for appropriate cost sharing? And then approach 1, we really look at it, there's a variety of ways in which we discussed that hurdle rate could be defined, and that often really kind of extended off of what the current TAC and WAC charges are today, which, if we look at for the California BAA, our current WAC charges are, a little over $16. We did our own research into some of the other BAAs, and depending on its peak or off peak, those, range from, $6 to $10 roughly from the numbers that we saw. And so particularly if we're looking at a pancake rate charge, there was some concern of will this create, if a significant amount of the transmission is being made available to the market, and that the market's going to be really functioning on this transmission, will these hurdle rates really create a significant inefficiency such that we're not going to really be able to get all the benefits. So that was kind of an open question we had really at the end of, can we do better? And so that really kind of led us to looking at a sort of 3 incremental proposals, and that's really going to be the focus of this afternoon discussion of, are there ways in which we can have potentially, after the fact, different types of uplift costs based on different types of transactions that would allow parties to allow for a fair cost sharing, allow parties to be kept whole, but hopefully allow for sort of a more efficient dispatch and optimization of the market. And so that I really think on these 3, I'd like maybe stressing before that I recognize the fact that under each of these approaches, there are really pros and cons, that we really teed up sort of there's a variety of questions. Kind of first and foremost is kind of what is that, what are those amounts that need to be recovered, and what sort of should we basically be sort of, what's that total quantity of revenue that we should basically be looking to have some sort of after the fact uplift cost on. And then I think the second real question is, who are those parties and how are you assigning those costs? And that how do we have sort of equity and efficiency in aligning those 2 measures? And so we're going to get into that a little more into this afternoon session, but at least I sort of want to recognize kind of upfront from the proposals that we kind of recognize the fact that we're kind of putting these ideas out there. And I really think that what at least we're looking for at a fundamental level is, trying to understand what your arrangements look like, what your concerns look like, and then from there trying to take that next step and saying, is there one of these that we really should be focusing in on because this is the one where we really feel like we get for the bang for their buck, or there might be an entirely different option that you all want to put on the table to say, here's a different method in which we can basically accomplish these same goals. So yeah, so I'll stop there for now, but yeah, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Partha. So before we take a break, we can take a couple of clarifying questions. As Partha mentioned, we're going to get into this topic a little bit deeper later on. So I do know we do have somebody virtually, Bonnie Blair. So Bonnie, if you want to just state your affiliation and your question, we'll start with you.
As a reminder, please accept the message to become unmuted. Your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Bonnie. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. So if you're going to get into this later, I can certainly wait. But as you were describing in particular bucket 1 transmission, and I was tying it back to the description earlier about how the RSE would work, is the bucket 1 transmission sort of defined on an hour-by-hour basis by the outcome of the RSE test?
No, actually, bucket 1 transmission, this is George Angela, this video, so needs to be declared before 9 a.m. because it's used in the resource efficiency evaluation. So it's not the outcome, it's the input into the RSE. It allows the ability for BAAs to exchange requirements for the RSE before we perform the RSE. So if you have, for example, an energy transfer of 100 megawatts from BAA to BAB, and it's a bucket 1 transfer, it's declared before 9 a.m., the 9 a.m. resource efficiency evaluation, what we'll do is it will transfer 100 megawatts of demand forecast from BAB to BAA. And a similar process with imbalance reserve bucket 1 transfers. So you have the ability for BAAs to exchange requirements for the RSE through this bucket 1 transfer declaration. So they're required for the RSE. They're not the outcome of the RSE.
Okay. I think I'm following. So first of all, it would only apply to transfers from one BAA to another, right? We're not talking about internal transmission.
Yes, this is all transfers on interties between BAAs.
Okay. All right. Thanks. That helps.
All right, Christina, I think we have another question queued up in chat or.
Yeah, I have two in the verbal queue, and then I'll read off the chat question. So we'll go to Rohan first.
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Please state your name and affiliation first, so go ahead.
Rohan, your line has been unmuted. Can you please go ahead? As a reminder, please accept the message to become unmuted.
And we can go to Laura next and then go back to Rohan.
Okay, sure. Laura, your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Oh, the joys of virtual.
Hi, this is Laura Trelease from the Energy Authority. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Great, thank you. I also have a question on bucket 1 transmission. When I was reading through the proposal, on page 9, there's a statement in there about contractual agreements for energy and capacity transfers for RSC must make bucket 1 transmission available. My understanding is that bucket 1 would be made available at 9 a.m. But then we talked earlier about there is supply that will be counted as part of the resource efficiency test where the transmission is not known. And so I'm just trying to get a sense of it. It seems like bucket 1 transmission is required sometimes for some resources, but not other times. And when is that distinction made, and why would there be a requirement for some resources but not for all?
Thanks, Laura. This is Danny. I think that's one of the things that we're looking to discuss in more detail this afternoon. I think to the extent that we know where the resource is and can have an understanding of where the transmission path is, it's much better from a modeling and an efficiency standpoint. However, we are still looking to be inclusive of resources that may not have resource specificity in the day ahead time frame and may not have that bucket 1 transmission. But what you're highlighting is something we're aware of.
Thanks. Yeah, just one of the things to think about as far as what's being required for bucket 1 and then potentially allowing unscheduled bucket 2 to be made available to Edam. One of the unintended consequences may be that transmission customers that currently buy long-term firm transmission and those revenues that the TSP relies upon may be disincentivized to continue to do that. And now you have a much larger revenue shortfall for the TSP that the market would have to make up, or there would need to be some kind of mechanism to avoid cost shifts between customer groups. So I think as you look at the different buckets, it's good to look at them separately, but as a whole proposal, I think there needs to be a look at what's the impact to a transmission service provider and what potential incentives or disincentives are being created with this transmission model.
Yep. Thanks for that comment. All right. You want to go to the next one in queue, Christina, or go back to the previous?
Yeah.
Yes. Your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Rohan, we're still not able to hear you.
Okay.
You can also send your question in the chat.
Yeah, do you have the chat question, Christina? Let's go with that, and then we'll go for a break.
I'll go to the chat question. And Rohan, you can send your question in the chat as well. So we did receive a question from Leah Fisher, Public Generating Pool. How does CAISO view voluntary participation in EDAM as it relates to provision of transmission in EDAM? Specifically, if bucket 2 unscheduled transmission rights are required to be offered, does that conflict with voluntary participation in ISO's view?
Yes, this is Milos with the ISO, and thank you, Leah, for the question. If I understood it, I think maybe you're referring to the concept of bucket 2 that we've described as the starting point being the transmission is voluntarily made available, but then we've also put out this kind of enhancement to it that maybe is it more beneficial to the market, to the benefits if this bucket 2 is enhanced to effectively focus on unscheduled transmission that's effectively not utilized by that transmission customer. And I think those are two kind of separate frameworks that we're asking for stakeholder comment on. You know, as Partha noted, the transmission under bucket 2 is voluntarily made available. Again, that raises potential certain concerns with withholding of transmission. There may potentially be some rules to limit potential use of that transmission in real time. But if we're focused on this enhanced framework or approach that we put forward of unscheduled transmission being made available, you know, I think that can address this concern of withholding, but also may make additional transmission available, you know, to increase those benefits of transfer. So I see those kind of related, but separate frameworks that we want to get stakeholder feedback on because they do have different implications, and would appreciate some perspectives on that in the comments.
Thanks, Milos. All right, so I think we're going to take a break. Time to refresh the. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, we do have a hand raised, and it might be Rohan. So.
All right, we'll try one more time. One more time.
Sure. As a reminder, you'll hear a message saying that your line has been unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, now we can. Success. Thank you.
Wow. Sorry about that. I am not sure what's going on, on my end, but I apologize for the inconvenience.
Please state your name and can you just state your name and affiliation, please?
Yeah, Rohan Chatterjee, Pacific Corp. So I think these are probably just comments because I know we're going to have a transmission deep dive later in the afternoon. So, not looking for detailed answers at this time. The first comment I have is specific to bucket 2, which is pertaining to the unscheduled transmission rights. Reading the straw proposal and based on past feedback that was given by folks at the ISO in our previous conversations with them, once the unscheduled transmission rights, if they're made available to the market for the optimization, and then after 1 p.m., those could be reutilized by the transmission customer. And if that did happen, the real-time market would re-optimize, potentially leading to congestions. One of the questions / concerns I had was if that becomes a paradigm for all transmission customers and, transmission customers got into the habit of sort of rescheduling the transmission rights that were optimized by the market after that 1 p.m. time frame, consistently that practice across the footprint may lead to, more real-time re-optimization. And so we can probably discuss this more in the afternoon session, but kind of curious to hear the ISO's thought on mitigating that scenario where, a lot of the transmission customers, choose to reuse those transmission rights once they're made after that 1 p.m. time frame. So that's one comment I had. The second comment was pertaining to the WSPP Schedule C, the bucket 1 transmission rights. And I think this is more pertaining to, as a load serving entity, if the upstream transmission rights, the firm upstream transmission rights that I have to the boundary of my system are owned by the counterparty with whom I have that energy contract. So basically, they're supplying the energy, but they're also supplying the transmission, the firm transmission to the boundary of my system. I'd like to better understand from the ISO what mechanism would be in place for that upstream firm transmission that is owned by the counterparty, to be made available to the market optimization. Would it be the LSE's requirement or sort of obligation to coordinate with that counterparty to make sure that that upstream transmission that is owned by them becomes available to the market optimization run at 10 a.m.? How is that obligation going to play out? And just want to have the conversation to better understand what the folks at the ISO are contemplating. So hopefully both those comments made sense. And let me know if you have any questions.
Any response? Otherwise, I think appreciate your comments. And I think we're going to be getting into some more of those details later on. So thank you, Rohan. All right, I think we're ready for a break. Time to refresh some coffee, water. There's beverages in the back of the room. And also at the atrium, there's probably some more breakfast snacks if you need a bite to eat. We'll come back in 15 minutes, so 11 o'clock. See you back here. Thank you. All right, everyone. I think we're ready to get started again. You want to just sort of wander back to your seat. Like Mark said, it is like a wedding reunion all in one. Everybody's happy to, the dancing is about to start. No. All right, can everybody at the back of the room please come back to your seats? I think we're ready to get started. I know everybody's super excited to see each other. Feels a little bit normal again to socialize. All right. Okay, so we're going to continue on with the Edam Straw Proposal Initiative discussion. I did want to mention that we have a lot more people that have joined us virtually. We have now upwards of 300 people. So welcome to all of you again that have joined us virtually. Really happy to see the level of engagement and participation. Thank you very much. The other thing I just wanted to mention for our virtual guests, I know the resolution on some of the slides maybe a little bit lower quality. We do have the slide deck available on our website, so you can pull the slides up directly if you're trying to look at some of the more detailed slides. Okay, and I think Christina provided that link in the chat if you need to get to that document. All right, so good discussion so far. Really great questions and comments from the audience. So we will keep that trend going, and I'll turn it back over to Milosh to continue. Go to the next slide on the day-ahead market processes. Okay.
All right, thank you, Joanne, and welcome back, everybody. I think we moved through some of a couple of the harder topics, more meaty topics. Now we get into the day-ahead aspect of the what happens between 10 and 1 p.m. And just in the interest of time, you'll see us be a bit more brisk in how we move through these slides, and then we'll pause for questions after we get through this section. But without further ado, I'll turn it over to James, who is going to walk us through the IFM and RUC portion.
Thank you, Milosh. So the purpose of these slides is to provide a high-level overview of the essential day-ahead market functions. The day-ahead market produces schedules and awards in two sequential processes. The first being the IFM, or the Integrated Forward Market, and the second being the RUC, or the Residual Unit Commitment. So these next few slides will go over a high-level look at the purpose and function of these two processes, as well as some Edam-specific context. So we'll start with the IFM. The IFM is a day-ahead financial market in which supply bids and demand bids are optimized together to find the least cost solution to procuring the energy demand, as well as after the day-ahead market enhancements is implemented, the Imbalance Reserves, and does this while respecting network constraints and resource constraints in the market. For the ISO, the Integrated Forward Market also co-optimizes the set of ancillary services, and as was already noted, at least initially, the Edam would not do this for non-CAISO entities, at least at the start. The other function that is relevant to the CAISO specifically, but not relevant at least at the start for Edam, is convergence bidding, and that has its own set of slides coming up in a few minutes. The main difference between how entities participate in the Integrated Forward Market and how they participate in the Western EIM is that the Western EIM doesn't use demand bids. So BAs or load serving entities or their scheduling coordinators are not providing bids into the Western EIM for demand. In the day-ahead market, in the integrated forward market, entities can either self-schedule demand or provide economic bids for demand where demand bid would only clear at certain price levels. And so in the working groups, we spent some time talking about, because the IFM is a financial market and there are, interactions between bids, not all of the time does the integrated forward market schedule energy that covers the BAs up to their forecasts, and that's where REC comes in. And so these bottom slides are essentially to say that the purpose of the REC is to sort of fill in the gap between the energy that was scheduled through the financial process, and then the REC, being a more of a physical process, will fill in the gap with physical supply. And to the extent that entities, we spent maybe 3 or 4 working group meetings in the resource efficiency evaluation talking about, why REC exists and how, if entities are trying to decrease their dependence on the REC process, there are ways that they can bid in the IFM their demand to decrease their dependence on REC. So part of the integrated forward market that's proposed is a new imbalance reserve product. So at a high level, the imbalance reserve product procures 15-minute ramping capability to cover both forecast uncertainty and intra-hour ramping capability needed in the real-time market. The second bullet has a fairly long list of the reasons we think imbalance reserves enhance the benefits of the EDAM. First being that there's a diversity benefit that can occur. The principle being that each individual BAA has a certain level of uncertainty that it needs to meet in the resource efficiency evaluation. But because not all of the uncertainty between the various geographic regions are going to be coincident, the footprint-wide, EDAM footprint-wide uncertainty should be less than the sum of the individual BAA's uncertainty. And because of that, we can capture a diversity benefit where similar to the EIM, where we can reduce the amount of imbalance reserves that are needed to be procured through the market, taking advantage of this diversity. EDAM, or imbalance reserves, we feel builds confidence in the solution to provide coordinated capacity to address unrealized uncertainty through the fact that the product is deliverable. We think that it allows more optimal scheduling of energy and transfers by accounting for uncertainty and ramping needs. So by co-optimizing the capacity that's needed to meet uncertainty with energy schedules in the IFM can produce a more optimal solution and weigh the trade-offs between providing a resource providing energy and being held for capacity for uncertainty reasons. The imbalance reserves allows a BAA to meet its uncertainty needs from resources across the EDAM footprint. So the as part of EDAM, BAs will have access to imbalance reserve transfers, where imbalance reserve capacity can actually be exchanged between BAAs. And so rather than an individual BA relying on its own resources to meet its own uncertainty, they'll have a larger pool of resources available across the footprint to meet that. The imbalance reserves establishes both a consistent metric and a consistent treatment of uncertainty for the EDAM resource efficiency evaluation. So by this, we mean that imbalance reserves is the mechanism by which all EDAM participants would be evaluated in terms of the uncertainty requirement for the resource efficiency evaluation. It ensures that each BAA is subject to the same requirements, or at least the same methodology to calculate their requirements. And finally, for suppliers, imbalance reserve provides revenue opportunities within the EDAM for BAs with flexible resources beyond what is provided in energy. They'll have the opportunity to earn revenues by trading capacity with other BAs. So that's the basics of the integrated forward market and the imbalance reserves. Next, the sequential process then leads us into RUC. So like I said, RUC will procure incremental or decremental capacity that's needed to meet the difference between where the IFM energy schedule is clear and the BAA's load forecast. So without the RUC, like I said, because the IFM is a financial market where it's clearing supply bids against demand bids and not supply bids against a forecast, the RUC is needed to make sure that physical supply is there to meet the forecasted demand. Supply participates in RUC by submitting reliability capacity bids, and the RUC produces hourly reliability capacity awards. The RUC process also enables transfers of reliability capacity between BAs, similar to transfers of energy and imbalance reserves. And the RUC process also produces prices for the reliability capacity products. So in the Edam, we have a couple of proposals that are specific with how Edam entities interact with the RUC process. First of all, we think that both the IFM and the RUC process that we have today are both important and complementary components of a well-functioning day-ahead market. We propose that the RUC process remain a critical component of the Edam. And then the final bullet is related to how, because reliability capacity is not explicitly considered within the resource efficiency evaluation, we propose that all of the supply that's offered into the IFM or offered into the resource efficiency evaluation must make the same quantity of capacity available through bids for reliability capacity. So essentially what that does is it ensures that all of the resources shown for resource efficiency evaluation up to their full quantity are able to be considered in the RUC process, and entities could not essentially withhold capacity out of the RUC process because the RUC bids are not part of the resource efficiency evaluation. And that was my last slide, so I'll turn it over to George to talk about market power mitigation.
Thank you, James. Good morning.
Sorry, green.
More vigorous. So market power mitigation is a feature that you will find in every organized market. And the reason being that suppliers could potentially exercise market power due to their location on the grid. If we really need to take their energy, their supply to either mitigate transmission congestion or serve load in an area. In the California ISO markets, the mechanism that we use to evaluate whether there are competitive conditions in either mitigating transmission congestion or serving load in an area is what we call the three pivotal supplier test, which essentially finds out which are the three largest suppliers that either provide supply counterflow to transmission congestion that we want to mitigate, or suppliers within an area that we want to serve load. And we find out if it is necessary to accept any energy from these suppliers to perform those two tasks. Then that indicates that the conditions for either mitigating congestion or serving load are not competitive. The economic theory says that you could have potentially up to three suppliers colluding to exercise market power. So that is an indication that we need to mitigate bids to avoid this outcome. So in either case, in the case of trying to mitigate transmission congestion, if that transmission congestion is uncompetitive, we mitigate all the suppliers that they provide counterflow to mitigate that congestion. And in the case of mitigating supply for serving load in an area, if the conditions are not competitive in the area for serving load, then we mitigate all suppliers for serving load in that area. How exactly we perform this mitigation? For energy bids, we use the default cost-based bids for each supplier, for each resource, and we substitute for the submitted bid the default cost-based bid if it is lower. But we perform this mitigation only above what we call the competitive LMP, which is the locational marginal price at the location on the grid that we consider that there are competitive conditions. And we strip out from that LMP contributions, marginal congestion contributions from transmission constraints that are not competitive. With the day-ahead market enhancements, we introduced additional mitigation for the capacity products that are introduced in the day-ahead market enhancements, namely imbalance reserves and reliability capacity. And we intend to perform the same kind of mitigation based on the 3 pivotal supplier test, but here the difference is that for capacity, we don't have default availability cost prices. So we're going to rely on the concept of the competitive locational price, but now it's not an energy price, it's a price for the capacity product. So we'll mitigate imbalance reserve bids, we'll cap them at the competitive locational marginal price for the imbalance reserve product, and similarly for the reliability capacity. So for the purpose of mitigating transmission congestion, the bids for transmission congestion, we're not changing anything from what we have already implemented in the ISO markets and in the Western Energy Imbalance Market, other than the fact that we don't observe BAA boundaries in that mitigation. So any resource that provides supply counterflow is a candidate for mitigation. For the what we call BAA level mitigation, for if the BA does not have competitive conditions for supplying for serving load, we also extend the existing process that we have today in the Western Energy Imbalance Market, which essentially will play out in Edam the same way. We test each Edam BAA except the ISO BAA. And the trigger for that test is the saddle price of the power balance constraint of that BAA being higher than the saddle price of the ISO balancing authority area power balance constraint. So if that happens, that indicates that somewhere between the ISO and that Edam BAA, there is an interface that is congested from transfers hitting the scheduling limits in the input direction to the Edam BAA that triggers that test. That indicates that supply is restricted for serving load in that BAA, so we test for the competitive conditions applying the 3 pivotal supplier test again. And if that test tells us that competitive conditions do not exist, then we mitigate all supply in that BAA. So that test is performed for each BAA independently. Now, so it's a simple extension of what we do in EIM, but we do realize that there is a great room for improvement here. And we will discuss improvements to this methodology in the upcoming price formation enhancement initiative. I believe the kickoff stakeholder meeting is coming up on June 9. But just to give you a very high-level description of the major enhancement that we propose here, or we will propose and discuss in the price formation enhancements, is that instead of testing for BAA level mitigation BAAs independently, we realize the fact that they could be grouped and test a group of the BAAs, that the group could actually have competitive conditions for serving the load in the group, although individual BAAs may fail. So obviously BAAs that they don't have price separation because there's no transfer congestion between them, they form one unified market, and we'll test a group for that, or we propose to test a group for that. And the next level of sophistication going in that direction is to actually group multiple BAAs, going down through a merit order list where we start with the BAA that has the highest saddle price for the power balance constraint. going down and keep grouping the AAs in groups that go bigger and bigger as we move down that list until we find the group that competitive conditions hold for the entire group. So obviously we'll provide some more details and we'll discuss all this in the price formation enhancements along with other additional enhancements that we're thinking that are appropriate for this level of mitigation. So we'll take a rain check here and we'll discuss this later on in the price formation, and I'll give it back to James. Thank you.
Okay, so just a few slides here on convergence bidding. For convergence bidding in Edam, convergence bidding is a feature in all organized forward markets, and we realize for some Western entities that haven't participated in a day-ahead market that convergence bidding is sort of a new feature that needs to be explained. So convergence bids are purely financial bids. They do not represent physical supply or physical demand. Convergence bids are only submitted in the day-ahead market. Convergence bids are not part of the real-time market. Essentially how convergence bids work is that if you clear what we'll call virtual supply, you are paid the day-ahead market price. And then in the real-time market, you're charged back the set of 15-minute locational prices. Now for virtual demand, they're charged the day-ahead locational price and then paid the set of 15-minute locational energy prices. What this is trying to do is to provide an incentive to converge prices between the two markets, which has many benefits, both for participants and really for the market health itself. Notably that there are market power protections by making sure that entities cannot arbitrage load or supply between the two markets by taking advantage of different market prices or expected market prices. Convergence bidding allows for additional market liquidity and has other benefits that we think, for those reasons, that we would propose to maintain convergence bids in the California ISO BA in Edam. However, we are proposing at this point a transition period for convergence bidding extension to the larger Edam footprint for several reasons. One is that because this is a large implementation effort, and there may be early modeling challenges or other things at the beginning of Edam that could financial players may be able to take advantage of and potentially, at least at the start, siphon value away from the physical participants. We think that it's prudent to allow for some time to evaluate that, the way the markets are modeled and implemented in Edam are done so in a way that there are no major arbitrage issues here. The second is that we recognize, like I mentioned, that a lack of familiarity with convergence bidding for the Western entities that are not participating in organized markets could potentially lead to unintended financial impacts or cost shifts. So it may be prudent to allow for, at first, in Edam, non-CAISO Edam areas, only for physical participation, and allow for a transition period to get entities used to participation in this way. However, a lack of convergence bidding in Edam areas may require, in the interim, some bidding requirements to maintain appropriate market incentives. And so those types of issues would have to be worked out in upcoming proposals. The specific timeline of a transition period is not necessarily proposed. I think it could be a year or so, but we're committed to sort of reevaluate and discuss introduction of convergence bidding with the Edam participants after some predefined time of operational experience. And with that, I think I'm passing it to Milos.
Thank you, James. And I'll touch on external resource participation. This refers to resources that are located in outside of the Edam footprint in a non-Edam balancing authority area that are being offered into the market. And I think for reference, I want to talk a little bit about what happens in the EIM today, in that external resources, those that are again located in non-EIM areas, they can be offered into the market to the extent that they're source specific. They can be economically bid, and these are your typical pseudo-tied or dynamically scheduled resources that are associated with a particular source, and under the appropriate tariffs, they may also have certain contractual arrangements and requirements to meet. But also supply that's under contract with the EIM entity, that can also be self-scheduled. This may not be associated with a particular source of supply, but if it's under contract, that self-schedule effectively indicates a contractual relationship and that the necessary arrangements have been made to deliver that generation to the Edam balancing authority area. And those, like I said, they can be self-scheduled. Intertie bidding, on the other hand, this refers to effectively economic bids at the intertide of the Edam entity balancing authority area that's not associated with a particular source. It's effectively supply that's delivered to that intertie. And today, that economic bidding or intertie bidding at the border of the EIM entity area is not allowed. The ISO does allow it at the border of the ISO balancing authority area. It's been a key feature of our market since effectively for a long time. But EIM entities do not currently allow that on their interties. And the reasons for that range from operational reasons, because that source of the supply may not be known, and there may be potential impacts to the extent that that generation does not perform or that supply is not delivered. There may be reliability impacts on the EIM entity balancing authority area. So in the EDAM then, what we've put forward is effectively an extension of that, or we're indicating a leaning towards an extension of that framework that's in the EIM in the EDAM. Effectively, as you can see in that table there, the ISO would continue to allow at its interties with non-EDAM balancing authority areas, pseudo-tied and dynamically scheduled resources to continue to economically bid or be self-scheduled. Contracted supply can also be self-scheduled, but intertie bidding, economic bidding as well, that's not associated with a particular source, that can continue at the ISO, but not at the ISO EDAM entity interties, at the interties of the footprint of the EDAM. And again, I think some of the same rationale extends here in the EDAM. We've heard in the stakeholder working groups a number of operational concerns of allowing intertie bidding, economic bidding at the EDAM entity interties, potential reliability impacts, and in the day-ahead time frame, you could displace certain internal generation, long start units, and ultimately that supply that's not associated with a particular source, or you don't know the quality of that supply that's economically bid. If it displaces that internal generation, that generation may not be able to effectively be brought online in time if the intertie supply does not show up. We've also heard concerns about potential transmission free riding, in that how is that supply now that's not associated with a particular source that's economically bid at the EDAM entity intertie, how is it paying for transmission that ultimately it's using across the EDAM footprint? But the other element that we've heard is certain incentive concerns as well with participation in the EDAM, in that if external resources, including non-source specific supply, can bid in, what incentive, does that impact the incentive for certain entities to join the EDAM? Can they derive the same benefits without necessarily incurring some of the same costs of joining and participating in the EDAM and investing into that infrastructure? So as I noted, we're leaning towards retaining that EIM framework of external resource participation and extending that to the EDAM. But this is one of those important areas that we're seeking stakeholder feedback on. And we've posed a couple of questions in the straw proposal that we would appreciate stakeholder perspectives on. We recognize this is an important issue, particularly in the day-ahead context. So with that, let's turn it over to Anya to cover GHG accounting.
Great. Thank you, Miloš. All right, so for this section on greenhouse gas accounting, my goal is that folks in the room understand the approach we took in the straw proposal, as well as the basic design and mechanics of each of the options on the table. Through this stakeholder process and working group process, there were 2 proposals that emerged, and a thank you to Kevin Head at the CAISO for facilitating those working groups and for folks coming forward with alternative proposals. We landed on the resource-specific approach as well as the zonal approach. Both were included in the straw proposal. We also included an initial leaning towards the resource-specific approach at the onset of EDAM from an implementation perspective, and as a more defined option that also aligns with the WEIM today. We are very interested in your feedback on both approaches and how they align with existing and emerging regulatory structures. So to start with an overview of the resource-specific approach, and as a reminder, we're going to be touching on these tomorrow in a deeper dive, and Claire with WPTF is going to have a panel discussion. But to start with the resource-specific approach, the market's really optimizing greenhouse gas costs bid in by generators. There is attribution, and some of the key design features are the bidding mechanics. It is voluntary in cases where a resource is in a non-greenhouse gas regulation area, and they're indicating kind of their willingness to serve a greenhouse gas regulation area through their bid that indicates the price and quantity. This voluntary adder is also kind of suggested as part of the design when you have kind of an unlinked state of the world where 2 greenhouse gas regulation areas don't recognize each other's compliance instruments. And so we're suggesting at the onset in an unlinked state that there be a greenhouse gas bid adder where, say, California offering into Washington would also have that voluntary greenhouse gas bid adder in addition to the energy bid, which includes their cost of greenhouse gas compliance. And that leads to the second point. The energy bid itself would include the cost of greenhouse gas compliance when the resource is in a greenhouse gas regulation area, and also in a linked state of the world where different greenhouse gas programs recognize each other's compliance instruments. We're also making some enhancements to the resource-specific approach to limit secondary dispatch. We're doing this through an improved baseline. So today in the WEIM, there's a self-submitted base schedule. We're planning on using the RSE solution to have a more accurate counterfactual to help limit that secondary dispatch. We're also implementing constraints to limit attribution based on transfer schedules. So in cases where attribution exceeds transfer limits, we would no longer count those. In cases where the BAA is a net importer, there would also not be attribution. And we'll look at this further tomorrow. So this slide is really a click down of kind of the content I shared on the previous slide, really reflecting in green 2 different greenhouse gas regulation areas, reflecting that the energy bid and GHG bid can be different, reflecting that internal to that greenhouse gas regulation area, their energy bid includes their cost of greenhouse gas emissions, and when offering to another greenhouse gas area that's unlinked, there would be that separate GHG adder. It also shows how a non-greenhouse gas zone in orange could offer into a greenhouse gas regulation area and indicates the contribution to secondary dispatch, which is really a part of what the optimization deems to that greenhouse gas area. The second approach on the table is the zonal approach, which was put forward, and it can be considered a combination of a resource-specific pathway and a hurdle rate. So it takes the approach of either viewing resources that might be external to a greenhouse gas regulation area as internal to the area, and also applies a hurdle rate for those resources that are not viewed as internal if the price differential is sufficiently high. There's two design aspects related to the zonal approach that I wanted to highlight here. First, just the design of the hurdle rate. This is something that in the working group, there is a lot of discussion in terms of how to design that hurdle rate. At the start, we're thinking about this in terms of a simple product of just the allowance price and emissions rate. It could become more complex, potentially a marginal emissions rate, potentially something that's dynamic. And again, the hurdle rate is just the price to transfer from a non-greenhouse gas regulation area to a GHG regulation area. The other aspects of the zonal approach are how resources make themselves available. Path 1 and Path 2 are really pathways to have the resource viewed as internal to a greenhouse gas regulation area when they physically sit outside of that area. Path 1 is considered kind of long-term commitments. From a mechanic standpoint in CAISO systems, this could be a master file flag. Path 2 is shorter-term commitments, and from a mechanic standpoint, this could be a cyber flag included in bidding. And then the other option is, all other resources that do not have this resource-specific pathway would be subject to a hurdle rate if the price differential is sufficiently high. And in this slide, I'm really simply trying to highlight those pathways. The green arrows recognize what's viewed as internal. And then you have the hurdle rate, which is a product of that allowance price and the emissions rate in cases where, an internal price to a greenhouse gas regulation area is higher than the external non-GHG regulation area and the hurdle rate, the transfer would occur. But if that's not the case, the transfer would not occur. So with that, I think I'm turning things over virtually to James Lynn for transfer revenue allocation, unless we're taking a break here.
I think we're going to take a couple questions or an opportunity to open up for questions, Anya. Thank you. All right, we have one hand raised in the room. Jan Strack, go ahead.
Hi, this is Jan Strack. I'm with San Diego Gas and Electric. So this is basically just a confirmation question, but I sort of think it's important that everybody is clear on this point. There's three elements that we've talked about, convergence bidding being one, the co-optimization being another one, and intertie being another one that are specific to the ISO. The ISO said we're going to maintain that capability within our system, but initially at least not allow it in the other EDAM entities. But I think the point I wanted to make is that by the ISO allowing it, it does have impacts on everybody. The whole footprint is going to be impacted, and benefits from those mechanisms, I think, will flow to the other EDAM entities as well. So I just want to I think that's an important point, and confirm that that's right, though, George or someone.
Yes, John, and the easiest way to see this is with the intertie bidding. Obviously, if an intertie bid to the California ISO scheduling point clears the market, that there's more supply coming into the ISO, that could potentially support more export transfers from the ISO to serve load in other BAAs. So yes, there are benefits that are realized, but obviously not the level of benefit that you will realize if you open it up for the entire market.
Jan, good. Thanks. All right. Christina, just checking virtually. Are there any questions in the queue or in the chat?
Yeah, Laura Trolleys has patiently been waiting in the queue, so let's go to her. And then we have a chat question.
Okay.
As a reminder, please accept the message to be unmuted. Your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Laura Trellis with the Energy Authority. I have a couple different questions. I'll start with one for Nilosh on external resource participation. I was wondering if the CAISO has considered contractual arrangements to provide imbalance reserves to an EDAM BA, which would be required to economically bid at the intertie. Would the CAISO be open to that type of arrangement?
Yes, hi, this is George Angelidis. So because of the inability or let's say, the screening that we don't support initially, at least intertie bidding at interties between Edam BAAs and non-Edam BAAs. It will not be possible to support imbalance reserve provision from external participants as well. So the avenue to do that is what Milos outlined in his presentation, where you could use the pseudo-tie approach or the dynamic scheduling approach with a resource-specific model at the boundary of the Edam.
Thanks, George. And then just a question on the transition period. I think this would go to James on RUC and convergence bidding. Can you help me understand what the RUC requirement would be for an Edam BA that doesn't have virtual bidding? Wouldn't the demand forecast be used in the IFM and all supply essentially be physical? Would there really be any requirement in the RUC? And then I have a follow-up.
Yeah, so the IFM clears not based on a forecast, but it clears based on demand bids. And so even without convergence bidding, there's still a need for the RUC process to evaluate if there's a difference between the way energy clears in the IFM and the BA's load forecast, then RUC would procure the difference essentially.
Okay, and then have you thought about if there are any themes or unintended consequences from having virtual bidding in the ISO footprint and not in Edam BAs now that you're optimizing on a broader footprint? Are there any unintended consequences to that? And I'm thinking even about a potential example where virtual supply in the CAISO BA could be awarded to meet demand in an Edam BA, and that Edam BA would then have to pay for additional RUC, which may end up costing them more than if they would have ran their own resource. There may be other scenarios, but in this example, if an Edam BA resource is $30 and there's virtual supply in the CAISO BA for $28, that would serve that load instead, causing that Edam BA to maybe buy a $4 RUC capacity, for example, that ends up costing them more than if they would have just ran their original resource. Is that a possibility for that scenario to happen, or are there other potential unintended consequences of having virtuals in one area but not in the full footprint during the transition period?
Yeah, so at this time, we're not overly concerned about unintended consequences or seams issues. It is entirely possible, like in your example, for virtual supply to displace physical supply if it comes on with a cheaper bid. One thing I didn't mention in the IFM slides is that the market considers virtual and physical supply on equal footing. Makes no distinction between the two bids, only is evaluating them based on price. For the particular example, it'd be kind of hard for me to walk through it on the fly, but happy to, if you email us the example, we can get back to you and maybe post it publicly for everyone's benefit.
Great. That's the end of my question. Thank you.
Thanks, James. I think we have one question in the room. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. This is Tiyin Gosa from Portland General Electric. This question is for James. When you were discussing the imbalance reserve, you mentioned about diversity benefit. My question is actually two parts. Number one, this diversity benefit, will it have transferability layer over it as a constraint? Number one. Number two, if it does, will the dispersance of the diversity benefit be constrained by these transfers?
I think the diversity benefit itself just would lower each individual BA's imbalance reserve target. And then once that is facilitated put into the market can still facilitate transfers between BAs. But if the question is if transfers themselves change the diversity benefit in each EDM BA, I think the answer is no. I just think that it reduces your individual requirement, and then transfers can still occur.
We are going to get into the details of that this afternoon as well, so more to come. Okay, so just real quick, we have one chat question to read, and then we'll move on. Christina?
Yeah. So Dave Zverik from ACES asked about, there's a bullet on slide 46. If pivotal supply is needed to serve load in an EDAM BAA, all supply resources, if pivotal supply is needed to serve load in an EDAM BAA, all supply resources in BAA are mitigated. Would this apply to the CAISO as well?
Not at this point, because we're simply extending this feature from the Western Energy Imbalance Market, and there is no mitigation in that respect in the Western Energy Imbalance Market for the California ISO. But as I mentioned earlier, we do intend to enhance this proposal in the price formation initiative. And we have a proposal there that will include the ISO BAA among the BAAs, so it won't be treated differently than other EDAM BAAs. We will test the ISO as well for competitive conditions for serving load in the ISO BAA.
All right, thanks for that, Christina. All right, I think we can move on now. I think we're going to move to James Lynn. So James is with us by audio. So James, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
All right, yes, we can hear you. You can go ahead.
Okay, so I apologize for not making it today. I had extenuating circumstances. I actually picked up COVID. So what I'm going to talk about today is the transfer revenue. And in the emphasis of time, I'm going to go through it relatively quickly. But we can have some discussion later on regarding what transfer revenue is. Now, as transmission is being made available to EDAM, all this transmission is eligible for transfer revenue as the market optimizes the transfer capability. So what I'm getting at in here is bucket 1, bucket 2, and bucket 3. As the market optimizes it for energy, imbalance reserve, or reliability capacity, there is an opportunity for it to be awarded for transfer capability. And at that such case, it's going to be eligible for transfer revenue. Now, this transfer revenue is collected when the transfer binds between the two BAAs. What I mean by that is when there is, let's say for energy, if the scheduling constraint is binding, you're going to get a price separation between the marginal energy cost between one BA and the other. Now, this separation of energy costs, marginal energy costs, is what is going to constitute transfer revenue. As we collect transfer revenue, we are going to take this transfer revenue and we are going to distribute it to the EDAM BA entity or transmission providers which have provided the transmission to the market. Now, how we're proposing to do this is an extension of the WEIM cost allocation for transfer revenue. Currently, we call it congestion rents. Now, what we're going to do is if it's between two EDAM BAAs that have provided a transfer point between the two scheduling points, then they're going to share in that transfer revenue. Now, the current default ratio is a 50-50. However, based upon some negotiations, it could be something different, 60-40. It all depends upon what the transfer point is in relationship to the scheduling points between these two EDAM BAAs. Now, if it is an EDAM BAA that is providing transmission all the way to the scheduling point of another EDAM BAA, then this is where the 50-50 is going to change, and this is more aligned with the ISO. The ISO, if you provide the transmission all the way to our scheduling point, then you're going to receive 100% of the transfer revenue, and any internal congestion, once you get beyond that scheduling point, that's going to maintain within the BAA where that resides. Now, if we can go to the next slide. So what I've done here is we have a very distinct description of what a transmission through and transmission to transfer location is. And with EDAM, we're going to have to enhance that definition and be able to discuss how this applies to all EDAM areas, including the ISO. Now, the transfer through transfer location, this is the standard. 2 EDAM BAAs have decided to join the EDAM market, and they have established a transfer location that's a midway point between the 2 scheduling points. Now, this transfer does not compete with a non-EDAM intertie BAA, but it does create an internal intertie between the 2 BAAs. Now, this transfer, if it becomes a binding transfer constraint associated with this intertie, basically the scheduling, we've exceeded the scheduling limit, then the transfer revenue is going to be distributed among EDAM BAA and EDAM BAB's entity or transmission providers at the default proration of 50-50 unless something else is discussed. If we go to the next slide. Now, this also creates what I call a mixed transmission, mixed transfer location. Now, in this case, I have an EDAM BAA, BAB, that is providing transmission to an agreed upon transfer location. But there's also a non-EDAM BAA that is going to be bidding in. Now, in order to facilitate the transfer and as well as incorporate the non-EDAM BAA bids, the EDAM BAA, which in this case would be ISO, provides additional transmission from that transfer location to the scheduling point. Under this condition, then the 200 megawatts between EDAM BAB and EDAM BAA is considered to be similar to 2 EDAM BAAs that are providing that transfer location, and the revenue would be split 50-50, and then anything associated with the non-EDAM BAA or and scheduling point and internal ITC would then be kept internal to BAA. So the next slide will address a transmission to transfer location. Under this consideration, I have an EDAM BAA that is providing transmission all the way to the scheduling point of BAA. Now, it also has non-EDAM BAA bids at that scheduling point. They are competing for the energy at this scheduling point. And so, therefore, since the EDAM BAA provided all the transmission to the scheduling point, if the transfer binds, then the transfer revenue associated with this transfer location would be assigned to EDAM BAB. Whereas, again, if the internal constraints bind, and that would be an intertie scheduling limit, then that entire scheduling limit would maintain the BAA because the BAA is managing that internal constraint. So in other words, it's 100% to BAB for that transfer revenue. Now, if we go to the last slide, there is another version of transfer 2 that we're going to have to address with EDAM BAAs. As WEIM BAAs join into EDAM BAAs, we are going to have a situation where it is going to have transmission provided to a scheduling point, but you won't have any external non-EDAM intertie schedules bidding in and competing against. Now, like the previous slide, this is considered a transmission to transfer location. And that is because EDAM BAB is providing transmission all the way to the scheduling point of BAA, and therefore it should receive 100% of the transfer revenue that's associated if this transfer binds. Okay, now that is the extent of my and transfer revenue discussion. Now, on the next slides, they're describing the settlement. Now, what I'm going to do is we're going to postpone this into future discussions. These slides are being provided to give you a high-level understanding of what we are currently seeing as a settlement of Edam energy, imbalance reserve, convergence bid, transfer revenue, reliability capacity. I'm also providing you some examples or some understanding of how this would interact with WEIM. The reason why I'm not going to go into details, because we are planning on having future technical groups on this, and as our design evolves, these slides are probably going to be modified and changed, and I think it's probably best that we discuss these in details at that technical group. But I did want to make sure that you had some understanding of where we currently stand under the settlement of the day-ahead market for Edam BAAs. Now, given this, I'm going to hand this back to Milos and George so that they can try and cover the transfer competence.
Thank you, James. And like James said, I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting that timeline and technical workshops in the later part of June and early July. This will be one of the items on settlements that we'll delve a bit deeper into, but we've got, as James said, a couple of tables there for your reference and some posterity if you want to take a look over some initial implications. As the design evolves, those will evolve as well. We want to wrap up here before lunch with a discussion on confidence in market transfers. I'm going to cover the first couple of slides, and then we'll turn it over to George to walk through a scenario that should help you illustrate and visualize what we mean when we talk about confidence in transfers. But this is an important element of the EDAM. As you all know, participating entities in the EDAM would rely on the market to serve load. The market would commit and decommit different resources that they have available across the footprint to serve the demand across the footprint. So it's very important that those participating entities have confidence in these market transfers, that they can depend upon and rely upon them to ensure that load can reliably be met. And so we're going to discuss some of the different features of the EDAM that enhance that reliability and provide that confidence in these transfers. And like I said, George is going to walk through a few scenarios. I think it's important just to start with a discussion just briefly on the roles of the market operator in the EDAM balancing authority areas, because that's going to be important for the examples. And as I noted at the beginning of the discussion, each EDAM balancing authority areas, aside from their transmission planning function and their resource planning function, they also retain their reliability function for their own balancing authority area. Participation in the EDAM does not create a single balancing authority area with a single entity that's responsible for reliability. But again, each balancing authority area retains that function and that responsibility for their own area. The ISO, as the market operator, would be operating the EDAM, and we're responsible for the reliability of the ISO balancing authority area. We're not taking on those obligations through the EDAM for other EDAM balancing authority areas. And so in stress and emergency system conditions, each EDAM BAA, just like they do today, they retain that discretion, that ability to maintain system reliability. They have access to different tools to maintain that operational reliability and continue to exercise that coordination with neighboring balancing authority areas and overall good utility practice. Just to briefly highlight some of the features that George is going to illustrate through his examples, but there are some, I think, three key components of the EDAM that provide for and enhance that confidence in market transfers. The first one is the day-ahead resource sufficiency evaluation. As you've heard, each EDAM balancing authority area brings sufficient supply to the market to meet their demand and a level of uncertainty, and that brings a certain pool of generation to the market that can potentially be relied upon as conditions change across the footprint. The market as well, and George is going to get into this a bit more, but the market also is going to ensure that the feasible commitments coming out of the market are effectively feasible, that the market is going to ensure the demand can be met in each of the balancing authority areas, plus the level of uncertainty before engaging in transfers out of those balancing authority areas. And then finally, the imbalance reserve product, again, that product that we've discussed a bit earlier today and that's being discussed in the DAME initiative, it really procures that additional capacity to address a level of uncertainty across the footprint. And these features, again, will help limit the risk of stress system conditions potentially becoming emergency conditions, because through these three different features, we think that as conditions change between day ahead and real time, we can be in a better position as a footprint to respond to those and not proliferate an emergency condition. Last slide here before the example. If you participated in our stakeholder working groups, you may recall us talking through a number of scenarios and really being focused in the later part of the working group on certain corner case scenarios. And what I mean by corner cases, really emergency, severe system emergencies, and what is the expectation of the Edam in those severe emergency conditions when an individual Edam balancing authority area may be in that position. And what we propose what we put forward in the straw proposal is that in those corner cases, now the market has done everything it can, but a balancing authority area still faces a reliability event. They've exhausted the individual tools that they may have available, and we're still in that corner event where they face load shed. What we put forward is that transfer sourcing out from that balancing authority area have equal priority to load. And what that means is effectively that if we're in those situations, the balancing authority area, consistent with good utility practice, operational discretion that they may have in engaging with other balancing authority areas, and with the continued coordination with other balancing authority areas, they would aim to minimize the impact on other balancing authority areas in those situations, and they would look to afford transfers equal priority to load in those situations. Again, still subject to that operational discretion and coordination with the adjoining balancing authority areas and those balancing authority areas that may be impacted potentially by any curtailments of transfers. And as I noted, again, it's important to emphasize here that each Edam balancing authority area, again, continues to retain access to any operational tools before they get into any of those corner case scenarios. And only once those have been exhausted, I think we find ourselves in this severe corner case. So with that, let's turn it over to George to walk us through through an example here. George, I know we're tight on time, but let's see what we can do.
Thank you, Milos. So we'll walk through this example that illustrates how transfers are used in the markets, IFM, RAC, and in real time. And hopefully that example will answer some of the questions we're getting, whether, virtual supply creates any issues, or we see any issues in the markets, and specifically if BAA is sufficient for RAC, do they need to bid reliability capacity or not? So some of these answers will be evident here. So this is our setup. So we have three BAAs. They're interconnected. BAA has a physical generator. It has a virtual supply and load, and also supports intertie bidding. So there is a system resource that provides an import bid to that BAA, and this comes from a non-Edam BAA. And that's $10, the virtual supply at $20, and the generator, the physical generator, at $40. The physical generator also bids for imbalance reserve and reliability capacity. You have a similar situation BAB, but there's no virtual supply, just generation and load, and also in BAC, but BAC also has an export self-schedule out to a non-Edam BAA. And there are, we assume here that there are bucket 2 transfers that the markets will use to find an optimal solution. And they're all good for 100 megawatts in either direction between these BAAs. So that's our setup. You can see I'm using different colors for the different commodities. Imbalance reserve is blue, reliability capacity is purple. So you can see the difference in the prices. BAAC is the most expensive. If we do a quick check here to see if this BAAs pass the test, you'll find out that they're sufficient. If you look at BAA, You have a load of 1,000 and a requirement, the imbalance reserve requirement, we assume it's 100 megawatts in every BAA. So you have a combined requirement of 1,100, right? So you have a supply of 1,000 megawatts and virtual supply of 100 megawatts and another 100 megawatts in import. So obviously you have sufficient capacity to meet the requirements. So BAA passes, and you'll see also the other BAAs also pass. And I, on purpose here, I structured the example so that each BAA is bringing just enough capacity to the market to pass the resource sufficiency test. As you can see, it's very tight, but they're all passing. But there's not really much available capacity beyond that point. I wanted to make a point. And we'll see in the solution what are the ramifications of that. So let's see how the IFM will find an optimal solution in this. Obviously, we're trying to displace the most expensive generation in the interconnected system. That's generator C, that was the most expensive generator. So the IFM will find a solution to utilize the transfers to get 100 megawatt energy from BAA to C, and also from B to C. 100 megawatts are limit on the transfer. So the transfers become binding, so they provide price separation for the energy. As you can see, the marginal prices for the energy are vary. Each BAA has its own price, $40 for A, $30 for B, and $50, that's the expensive BAA, for C. Both import and exports clear, the import to BAA and the export from BAAC. So you have a feasible solution in energy that also reduces the cost because you have essentially displacement of 200 megawatts of expensive generation in C with cheaper generation in A and B. The IFM solution will also procure imbalance reserves, and we're only showing imbalance reserves up in this example for simplicity. So remember, the requirement was for 100 megawatts of imbalance reserves in every BAA. Okay, so in BAA, you have 100 megawatts of spare capacity on the physical generator that will provide the imbalance reserves to meet the target for BAA. BAA-B, its available capacity is used to provide an energy transfer to BAA-C, so it doesn't have available capacity for procuring imbalance reserves to meet the target for BAA-B. But because of the displacement of the generator C with 200 megawatts of imported energy, there is enough capacity, available capacity in BAA-C, namely 200 megawatts, to procure imbalance reserve to meet BAA-C requirement plus the BAA-B requirement through an imbalance reserve transfer in the opposite direction of the energy transfer. So you can see here that the transfer between BAA-B and BAA-C is used for energy in one direction and for imbalance reserve in the opposite direction. So although there is price separation for the energy because the transfers are binding in the base scenario, in the imbalance reserve up deployment scenario, the transfer between B and C is not binding because you have a net flow of zero. So the price for imbalance reserve, you can see it's the same for C and B at $5 set by generator C, but the price in A is $4 because there is price separation even in the deployment scenario between A and the group of B and C. So that's the IFM solution that shows you how a transfer is possible to be used for energy and also for imbalance reserves to meet some other BAA requirements. What we want to stress here is that these transfers are economic. They're only scheduled if there is enough capacity in the BAA of origin to meet that BAA's requirements. So, for example, looking at BAA, you have this transfer of 100 megawatts of energy from BAA to BAB to BAC that is scheduled economically. If there was not enough capacity in BAA to meet the demand, the scheduled load of 1,000 megawatts and the imbalance reserve requirement of 100 megawatts, you would not have that transfer being scheduled. So it's economic. So it's very important to understand that we first each BAA meets its own obligations, and then if there is an opportunity for economic displacement, then transfers will be scheduled. Okay, these are economic transfers, the lowest priority. Let's move and see what will be the solution now in the RAC. So RAC leaves the IFM solution intact. So nothing changes as far as the IFM solution goes. So energy schedules and imbalance reserve are fixed. What RAC does is potentially schedules additional capacity as reliability capacity to meet the RAC target. So in BAA, we had a virtual supply that had an energy schedule, cleared the IFM. RAC will see that this virtual supply is not physical, so therefore it's not going to be there in real time, all right? So it will replace the missing energy from the virtual supply with reliability capacity. So there's a need for 100 megawatts of reliability capacity in BAA. The other BAAs, B and C, assuming that the load self-schedule is reflecting the demand forecast, they have a RAC target of 0. So there is no requirement for RAC for reliability capacity in B and C. So only BAA has a requirement for 100 megawatt of reliability capacity. But BAA, there is no any more physical capacity that is available because IFM used it all. Okay. Essentially, there was 100 megawatts spare capacity, but IFM used it to, as a 100 megawatt transfer to BAC to displace more expensive generation. Nevertheless, that transfer created available capacity in BAC because it's displaced that expensive generator. So now that generator has available capacity, and RAC will procure reliability capacity from that generator in BAC and will use the transfer to send back reliability capacity to BAA to meet the BAA requirements. All right, so you can see how the transfers can play a role of displacing more expensive energy or capacity. And even if the IFM solution leaves a BAA tight in its capacity, the previous transfers that they were scheduled in IFM create capacity in the BAA that receives that energy, which can then be used to procure reliability capacity to go back through the transfer. And this is what's shown here with the purple transfer of 100 megawatts of reliability capacity from C to A. What is important to note here is that both BAAB and BAC, which is the more important point here, they don't have a RAC target because they don't have virtual supply and the load schedule in their BAAs exactly at their demand forecast. So you could say that they don't need to bid these generators' reliability capacity because they don't have any local needs. However, if the generator GC in BAAC did not bid for that 100 megawatt of reliability capacity, that transfer of 100 megawatt of reliability capacity from C to A would not have been possible. And that would have left BAA short in meeting its RAC target of 100 megawatts. So that's why it is paramount to have any capacity that is bid in the IFM also be bid in RAC for reliability capacity to allow for this solution, which is the most economic outcome out of both markets, IFM and RAC. So this is the first lesson that we want to learn here. You want to bid all your available capacity in the markets, and definitely any capacity that is bid in the IFM should also be bid in RAC. We actually have this as a requirement in the STRO proposal to allow exactly for this scenario. In this scenario, BAC returns the favor of the cheaper energy input that it gets from BAAB, returns that favor as 100 megawatt of imbalance reserve transfer, and returns the favor to BAA as 100 megawatt reliability capacity transfer, because this is the most optimal solution you want to have on the grid. You want to schedule cheaper resources for energy and buy capacity from the more expensive resources. And this is exactly what happens here. But to have the solution, you have to bid it all. Anything that is bid in IFM has to also be bid in RAC. So lesson number one, bid all your available capacity in the markets. Now let's see what happens in the Western energy imbalance market in real time. So we have here a scenario, okay, where all the uncertainty that we targeted for, which was 100 megawatts in each BAA, materializes in real time. So you can see the load from 1,000 megawatt becomes 1,100 megawatts in every BAA, okay? Which means that all the capacity that we set aside as imbalance reserves and as reliability capacity is going to be deployed, all of it now. And that's what happens. You see that all the capacity that it's in each BAA is dispatched to serve the 1,100 megawatt of load. We don't have flexible RAM requirements here to show the example simple. Keep the simple example here. But what you want to take out from this is that each BAA essentially meets their own requirements in real time. There is no available capacity to have any kind of transfers. All right. So basically, the real-time market unwound all the transfers that the day-ahead market did to have a feasible solution in real time that addresses all the uncertainty that has materialized. What does it mean to have no available transfers in real time? It means that there are no economic benefits. There's no opportunity. There is opportunity for economic displacement, but there is no available capacity to do that. Why is that? This is because in this example, I set up the numbers specifically where each BAA brought to the market only enough capacity to pass the resource sufficiency evaluation test. So the capacity is tight. If the imbalance reserve requirements materialize, if all the uncertainty materialize, that means all the capacity is going to be used for serving its BAA's requirements, and you don't have any ability to have additional economic benefit from the EIM. So lesson number 2, to make the markets work for you and extract the maximum economic benefit from the markets, you must bid all your available capacity in the markets, not only just what you need to pass the resource sufficiency evaluation test. By the way, this was also lesson number 1, so more important here. Now, let's see what happens if we have available capacity. So the next scenario, to have some available capacity, we'll have in the scenario only half of the uncertainty materializes, so half of our target. So only 50 megawatt of uncertainty materializes in each BAA, so you can see the load becomes 1050. All right, now this leaves some capacity that is still available in the real-time market. So now you have the ability for the real-time market to find an economic solution where the more expensive generation in C, okay, can be displaced by energy transfers in real time now. These are dynamic transfers from A and B for a total of 50 megawatt capacity in each case, because you have 50 megawatt available capacity in BAA and in BAB to transfer into C to displace more expensive generation in C. So now here you have the scenario where, because there is available capacity in the market, the real-time market can extract economic benefits through economic displacement. So again, to have this happy scenario, you need to bid all your available capacity in the market. Well, that was the previous lessons, right? All right. So let's go to an unhappy scenario where, disregard the red numbers for a moment, where now we have 90 megawatt of a 100 megawatt target of uncertainty materializing BAA and in BAAB, but in BAC we have a problem. In BAC, the uncertainty that materializes goes beyond our 100 megawatt target. So now we have 130 megawatt of uncertainty materializing BAAC. All right, that's beyond our target. So what will the real-time market try to do? Obviously, we'll try to scrape up all available capacity that exists to meet the demand in BAAC. Because the uncertainty that materializes in A and B is 90 megawatts and we procured imbalance reserve for 100, that means we have 10 megawatt available capacity in A and B, and the market will schedule transfers, 10 megawatts from A to C and 10 megawatts from B to C to meet the uncertainty materializing in BAAC. So that will meet 20 megawatts of the 30 megawatt uncertainty, but we're still short 10 megawatts of capacity, and the solution is tight. You cannot find any more 10 megawatt of capacity. So what will the market do is we'll be faced to relax the power balance constraint in BAC. That's equivalent to, say, dropping load, although, of course, the market doesn't drop load, but will provide a solution to the operators that says, I cannot meet all the demand in BAC, which is 1130 megawatt of load, plus that 100 megawatt of scheduled export from the day-ahead market, which is, for our purpose of their example here, is a firm export. Okay? So in situations like that, what we say and what Milo said earlier, the export and the load have equal priority. So we will curtail the export and the load in the form of a relaxation of the power balance constraint pro rata. Because export schedules and all intertie schedules have to be integer, essentially the 100 megawatt export will be curtailed to 99 megawatts, and the load that will clear the real-time market will be 1121 megawatts, short by 9 megawatts. What would happen here if you didn't have the benefit of EIM? You would have a 30 megawatt of insufficiency in BAAC. So you have to cut more load and more export, 30 megawatts in total. The benefit that you have with the EIM, even in this unpleasant, unfortunate scenario, is still better to have the EIM because it still gave you 20 megawatts of energy through transfers. So you had to cut only 30 megawatts of demand, only 10 megawatts of demand instead of 30. So you still have a benefit that the market provides, and the market exhausts all available opportunity and capacity to do that. But in the case that it exhausts everything, then you have to rely on operator actions to pro rata curtail exports and institute certain load management protocols. The other thing that I want to point out here is because the power balance constraint violation is a high penalty price, you see here the $1,000 megawatt of the $1,000 price for energy in BAC, and note that it propagates also to BAAs A and B. That is because there's no price separation. Why? Because the transfers going into C, they're not constrained. These are 100 megawatt capacity transfers and only 10 megawatts is used because there was not available capacity other than these 10 megawatts in each BAA A and B. So price separation did not happen. So you see this high pricing all over the grid. Okay. This is another outcome that you may have if you don't have a lot of capacity available in the market. If there was available capacity in A and B, you would have more transfer coming into C. And even if you had to drop demand in C, those transfers would become binding, and they will provide price isolation between A and C and between B and C, so you wouldn't have the phenomenon of having the $1,000 price propagating through the entire grid. So this is lesson number 3. Bid all your available capacity in the markets to avoid situations like that and make it easy for everybody. So I'll stop here. We'll if you have any questions, we can bring them up here.
Lesson 4, never put George right before lunch.
Yeah. Thanks, George. I just love George's diagrams, don't you? But you did spare us from your typical algorithms in there, George. So
I reserve the right to do that at the workshop.
All right. I know we've gone over time, and I need to get you guys to lunch. So let's come back here at 1:15. So lunch is down in the cafe atrium, so complimentary buffet lunch. So please enjoy lunch. We'll see you back here at 1:15. Also, if anybody's interested in a tour of our control room, if it's your first time here, you want to take a look in our overlook area, you can collect in the lobby. There'll be a group collecting now to go into the control room.